Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of Victorian England, where three pairs of sisters lived lives so divided, so impossibly double, that their stories would shake the very foundations of society. One set of sisters spoke to the dead, or so the world believed. Another set hid their genius behind the names of men, and tonight you will discover that in an era obsessed with propriety and perfection, the most dangerous thing a woman could do was simply be herself. Now, before we step into the gaslit streets of the 1840s together, I have a small request. If you find yourself drawn into these stories, if you feel that pull of curiosity or connection, would you consider subscribing to the channel? Maybe hit that like button, or share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. And I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you in bed in California, on a late-night walk in London, studying in Tokyo? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're joining me from. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us begin. Picture this. It is a cold March evening in 1848 in a tiny wooden house in Hydesville, New York. Two young girls, 11-year-old Kate and 14-year-old Maggie Fox, lie in their shared bed, giggling under the covers. They have just discovered something remarkable. By cracking the joints in their toes and feet, they can make sharp rapping sounds that echo through the floorboards. It is a trick. Nothing more. A bit of fun to scare their mother, perhaps. But what starts as a childish prank on this single night will, within a decade, become a religious movement that sweeps across 2 continents. It will make these sisters wealthy beyond imagination. It will bring them fame, scandal, tragedy, and ultimately a confession that shocks the world. But let us pause here, because to truly understand how 2 ordinary girls could change history with the cracking of their toe joints, we need to understand the world they lived in. We need to talk about what it meant to be a woman, to be a sister in the Victorian era. Imagine living in a time when your entire existence was defined by a single word: propriety. The Victorian age, roughly 1837 to 1901, was named after Queen Victoria herself, and it was obsessed with the idea of respectability. On the surface, this was a golden age, an age of industrial progress, of scientific discovery, of the British Empire spanning the globe. The Victorians built railways and telegraphs. They believed in reason, in morality, in the steady march of civilization. But underneath that gleaming surface, darkness, hypocrisy, a chasm so wide between public virtue and private vice that it could swallow people whole. For women, this contradiction was suffocating. There was this concept, this ideal, called the angel in the house. It came from a poem, but it became a prison. The perfect Victorian woman was supposed to be pure, passive, devoted entirely to home and family. She was not supposed to have ambitions. She was not supposed to have a career. She certainly was not supposed to have ideas that challenged men, or write books, or claim to speak with spirits for money. The author Sarah Stickney Ellis wrote in 1839, and I am paraphrasing here, that women existed to serve and to soothe, to make the home a sanctuary from the harsh world of business and politics. A proper woman was seen but not heard. She embodied morality but never discussed anything scandalous. She was ornamental, spiritual, and above all invisible in the public sphere. Now, here is the fascinating, tragic irony. While society demanded that women be angels, the reality was brutally different. Women worked. They worked as governesses in wealthy homes, teaching children for poverty wages. They worked in factories under horrifying conditions. Some, with no other options, turned to prostitution just to survive. But these realities, They were hidden, denied, because acknowledging them would shatter the illusion of Victorian respectability. This created what historians call the Victorian duality, a culture of double standards. Men could visit brothels, frequent opium dens, father illegitimate children, and as long as they maintained a respectable appearance, society looked the other way. But a woman who stepped even slightly out of line, ruined, her reputation destroyed, her prospects obliterated. So women learned to live double lives, not by choice, but by necessity. They learned to present one face to the world while hiding their true selves, their ambitions, their talents, their pain, behind a carefully maintained facade. Let me give you an example. There was a woman named Anne Lister, living in Yorkshire in the 1830s. Publicly, she was a landowner, a businesswoman, eccentric perhaps, but respectable. Privately, she was in a committed relationship with another woman, Anne Walker. She called Anne her wife. She coded her diary in a secret language to hide the truth of her life. She lived two realities simultaneously because there was no other way to survive. Or consider the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, living in a parsonage on the windswept Yorkshire moors. They were creative geniuses, burning with stories they needed to tell. But women were not supposed to be authors. Literature was a masculine pursuit. So what did they do? They became men, at least on paper. They published their first book of poems in 1846 under the names Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Masculine-sounding pseudonyms that gave them just enough cover to be taken seriously. The book sold exactly 2 copies. 2. Can you imagine that? Pouring your heart onto the page and having almost no one care. But they did not give up. Charlotte wrote a novel called The Professor. It was rejected by every single publisher. But one of those publishers sent her an encouraging letter, suggesting she try again. And she did. She wrote Jane Eyre in less than a year, drawing from her own painful experiences at a horrific boarding school, from her impossible love for a married man, from her rage at a society that treated women as property. When Jane Eyre was published in 1847, it was an instant sensation. People were obsessed with figuring out who Currer Bell really was. Was it a man? A woman? Meanwhile, Emily published Wuthering Heights, and Anne published Agnes Grey under their own Bell pseudonyms, and the speculation intensified. The Bell brothers became the subject of endless gossip and debate. But here is the thing. They could not reveal themselves. Not yet. Because the moment people knew they were women, everything would change. Their work would be judged differently, dismissed as emotional or sentimental. So they kept the secret. They lived as authors in hiding, as geniuses trapped behind borrowed names. And they were not alone. All across Victorian England and America, women were living these fractured existences, wearing masks, playing roles, the respectable daughter by day, the secret writer by night, the proper lady in the drawing room, the rebellious thinker in private, the devoted sister caring for aging parents, while inside dreams and ambitions burned like coals. Now, let us return to those 2 girls in Hydesville, to Maggie and Kate Fox and their toe-cracking trick, because what they stumbled upon, quite by accident, was a way to turn the Victorian duality into power, into spectacle, into a kind of freedom, however twisted it became. That first night, when the rapping sounds began, their mother was terrified. She thought the house was haunted. Neighbours rushed over, and the girls, frightened now themselves, kept going. They developed a code. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. Then they created an alphabet system. The spirit could answer questions by knocking at specific letters, and the spirit had a story. It claimed to be a murdered peddler named Charles Rosner, killed and buried in their basement 5 years earlier. This was pure fiction, invented by the girls in the moment, but it was gothic, dramatic, exactly the kind of story that the Victorians loved. They were obsessed with death, with ghosts, with the possibility of an afterlife. And there was a reason for that obsession. Life in the Victorian era was short and brutal. In the town of Haworth, where the Bronte sisters lived, 41.6% of children died before the age of 6. The average life expectancy was 25 years and 8 months. Families were haunted by loss. Mothers buried children. Wives lost husbands. The Civil War in America would kill hundreds of thousands of young men. People were desperate for comfort, for proof that death was not the end, that they might speak to their loved ones again. The Fox sisters offered that hope, or at least the illusion of it. Word spread. Hundreds of people came to the Fox house to witness the phenomenon. Some were believers. Others were skeptics determined to expose the girls as frauds. Committees were formed. Doctors examined them. But no one could definitively prove how the sounds were made. The girls were careful. They wore long dresses that concealed their feet. They learned to crack their joints silently without visible movement. And then their older sister Leah saw an opportunity. Leah was 34, a music teacher, struggling financially. She looked at her younger sisters and saw not children playing a prank, but a business, a future. She brought Maggie and Kate to Rochester and began charging admission to their séances, first in their home, then in larger venues. In November 1849 they performed at Corinthian Hall, one of Rochester's grandest auditoriums, in front of 400 people. The audience came hoping to see them exposed. Instead, they left amazed, confused, converted. The Fox sisters became celebrities overnight. And here is where the double life truly begins. Because Maggie and Kate were just children, 14 and 11 years old. They had started this as a game, and now it had consumed their entire existence. Publicly, they were revered mediums, conduits to the spirit world, almost holy figures. Privately, they were two frightened girls, locked into a lie that grew bigger every single day, controlled by a sister who saw them as a commodity. They could not escape. The world would not let them. Every time they tried to stop, every time the spirits went silent, Leah pushed them back on stage. Because by this point, it was not just about the Fox sisters anymore. Other people had started claiming they too could communicate with the dead. Hundreds, then thousands of mediums emerged across America and Europe. A religious movement was born. They called it spiritualism. And it all traced back to two girls cracking their toe joints in a farmhouse in upstate New York. So we have established the world. A world of impossible standards, of hidden lives, of women trapped between who they were and who they were allowed to be. We have met the Fox sisters, whose childhood prank became a nationwide phenomenon, and we've glimpsed the Bronte sisters, whose genius had to hide behind masculine names. But these stories are just beginning. We have not yet talked about the love affairs, the scandals, the alcoholism and despair. We have not discussed the moment when Maggie Fox, 40 years later, stands on a stage in New York City and confesses that it was all a lie. We have not explored how Anne Bronte wrote a novel so radical, so ahead of its time, that it would be suppressed for decades. We have not examined the terrible price these women paid for their double lives, or the extraordinary legacy they left behind. So stay with me. Because next, we are going to meet the Bronte sisters properly. We're going to walk the moors with them, feel the isolation of their lives and understand how 3 women from a tiny village in Yorkshire became some of the most important writers in the English language. We're going to see what it cost them to be brilliant in a world that demanded they be invisible. The night is young, and these stories deserve to be told in full. Let us continue together. There is something achingly beautiful about the Yorkshire moors in winter. The wind cuts across the hills like a knife, carrying with it the scent of heather and rain. The sky hangs low and grey, pressing down on the endless expanse of grass and stone. It is a landscape that feels alive, wild, utterly indifferent to human concerns. And it was here, in a small stone parsonage perched on the edge of the village of Haworth, that three sisters sat at a wooden table and quietly changed the course of literature forever. Charlotte Brontë was born in April 1816. Emily arrived in July 1818. Anne came into the world in January 1820. They were the daughters of Patrick Brontë, an Irish clergyman who had risen from poverty through sheer determination and education, and Maria Branwell, a gentlewoman from Cornwall who would die of cancer when Anne was barely a year old. The children were left in the care of their Aunt Elizabeth, a stern woman who believed in discipline and duty above all else. Now you might wonder what it was like growing up in that isolated parsonage. Haworth was not some charming country village. It was a place of shocking poverty and disease. The streets ran with sewage. There was no proper sanitation. Typhus and tuberculosis swept through regularly, claiming lives with brutal efficiency. Remember that statistic I mentioned earlier? 41.6% of children in Haworth died before their 6th birthday. The average life expectancy was just 25 years and 8 months. The Brontë children knew death intimately. Their mother died in 1821. In 1825, their two older sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, were sent to the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge. It was a horrific place, cold, unsanitary, with food so inadequate that children were constantly hungry. Both girls contracted tuberculosis there. Maria came home first, wasted away to almost nothing, and died at age 11. Elizabeth followed 2 months later at age 10. Can you imagine being Charlotte, 9 years old, watching both your older sisters die in the space of a few months? Knowing that you had been at that same school, that you had survived while they had not. That kind of trauma does not leave you. It marks you forever. And Charlotte would eventually pour that anguish into the pages of Jane Eyre, transforming Cowan Bridge into the nightmarish Lowood School, where Jane watches her friend Helen Burns die of consumption. But here is the remarkable thing. The Brontë children did not break under the weight of all this loss. Instead, they created entire worlds to escape into. Patrick Brontë, despite his sternness, believed in education. His library was filled with books, and he encouraged his children to read everything. Shakespeare, Byron, Sir Walter Scott, the Bible, newspapers, political pamphlets. The children devoured it all. And then they began to create. In 1826, Patrick brought home a set of 12 wooden toy soldiers for his son Branwell. The children immediately gave them names and personalities, and then they went further. They invented entire kingdoms for these soldiers to inhabit. Charlotte and Branwell created a place called Angria. Emily and Anne built a world called Gondal. Now, these were not simple childhood games. These were elaborate, detailed fantasy worlds with their own histories, politics, wars, and love affairs. The children wrote tiny handmade books, so small they could fit in the palm of your hand, filled with stories and poems about their imaginary kingdoms. They wrote in microscopic handwriting, creating volumes that only they could read. These books were their private universe, hidden from the adult world. Emily and Anne kept writing about Gondal well into adulthood. For Emily especially, Gondal was more real than the actual world around her. She poured her passion, her wildness, her understanding of human nature into these secret stories. And when she finally wrote Wuthering Heights, all that intensity, all those years of imagining complex, flawed, passionate characters would explode onto the page. But before we get to their novels, we need to talk about what their actual lives looked like, because the gap between their inner creative fire and their outer reality was vast. As young women, the Bronte sisters had exactly 3 career options. They could marry, which required money for a dowry that they did not have. They could live at home as dependents, which meant being a burden on their father forever. Or they could become governesses or teachers, so they became governesses, and it was absolutely miserable. Charlotte took a position with the Sidgwick family in 1839. She was 23 years old. In her letters, she describes the experience with barely contained rage. She was expected to care for the children constantly, with no time to herself, no privacy, no respect. The family treated her as a servant, someone beneath their notice except when they needed her. She wrote to her sister Emily, and I am paraphrasing here, that the children were wild and uncontrollable, and that she was treated with less consideration than a kitchen maid. Anne had a similar experience, though she endured it longer. She worked as a governess for the Robinson family at Thorpe Green Hall from 1840 to 1845. 5 years. She drew on this experience for her first novel, Agnes Grey, which quietly and devastatingly depicts the loneliness and humiliation of being a governess. The constant awareness that you are educated, refined, expected to teach manners and morals to children, yet treated as fundamentally inferior by their parents, invisible unless you made a mistake. Emily tried teaching exactly once, at a school in Halifax. She lasted 6 months before returning home, physically ill from the separation from Haworth and her beloved moors. Emily was the most intense of the sisters, the most private, the most fiercely attached to her home. People who met her described her as strange, silent, her eyes unsettling. She was most comfortable with animals, with the dogs and the hawks she tamed, with the wild landscape that mirrored her inner nature. But here is the thing about Emily. She might have been quiet, but she was also fearless. There is a story that once, when Emily was bitten by a dog that might have been rabid, she walked calmly to the kitchen, heated an iron poker until it glowed red, and cauterized the wound herself. No flinching, no asking for help, just practical, brutal efficiency. That is the woman who would write Wuthering Heights, a novel so violent, so passionate, so utterly unconcerned with being likeable that Victorian readers were genuinely shocked. This was not how women were supposed to write. Now, in 1842, something important happened. Charlotte convinced their aunt to lend them money to study in Brussels at a boarding school run by a man named Constantin Heger. The plan was for Charlotte and Emily to improve their French and German, then return to England and open their own school. Finally, they would be independent. They would not have to be governesses anymore. They spent almost a year in Brussels. Emily hated it and counted the days until she could leave. But Charlotte fell in love. Constantin Heger was married, the father of several children, and Charlotte's teacher. He was brilliant, passionate about literature, someone who finally saw Charlotte's intelligence and took it seriously. They debated books. He critiqued her writing. He challenged her. And Charlotte, starved for intellectual connection, for someone who treated her as an equal, fell desperately in love with him. She never spoke of it directly. She was a Victorian woman, deeply moral, horrified by the idea of adultery. but her letters to Hager after she returned to England are painful to read. She begs him to write to her. She counts the days between his infrequent responses. She's clearly tormented by feelings she knows are wrong but cannot control. Hager's wife eventually noticed and made sure the correspondence ended, and Charlotte was left alone in Haworth, nursing a broken heart and a love that could never be acknowledged. But she channeled all of that pain, all of that longing into her writing. The impossible love between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, the intensity of Jane's feelings, her refusal to compromise her principles even when it costs her everything, that came directly from Charlotte's own experience. In 1845, Charlotte made a discovery. She found some of Emily's poems hidden away, private, and she was stunned by their power. These were not the sentimental verses that women were expected to write about flowers and domestic bliss. These were dark, strange, beautiful poems about freedom and death and the wildness of nature. Charlotte convinced Emily and Anne to publish a collection together. They scraped together money from the small inheritance their aunt had left them and paid to have the book printed. Remember the pseudonyms? Currer Bell for Charlotte, Ellis Bell for Emily, Acton Bell for Anne. They chose names that were ambiguous, that could be male or female, that would protect their identities. The book was called Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. It was published in May 1846, and it sold exactly 2 copies. 2. Can you imagine that? Pooling your limited resources, putting your private creative work out into the world, and having virtually no one care. But they did not stop, because now they had tasted the possibility of being published authors. They each began working on novels. Charlotte wrote The Professor based on her experiences in Brussels. It was rejected by every publisher she sent it to, but one publisher, Smith, Elder & Company, sent her an encouraging letter. They said that while The Professor was not right for them, they would be interested in seeing a longer work from Currer Bell, and Charlotte, energized by this small bit of encouragement, wrote Jane Eyre in less than a year. She worked at the dining room table in the parsonage, writing while her father slowly went blind in the next room, while Emily baked bread and Anne corrected lessons. She poured everything into it. Her anger at the cruelty of Cowan Bridge School, her longing for independence and respect, her impossible love for Hager transformed into the relationship between Jane and Rochester, her absolute conviction that women deserve to be treated as human beings with minds and souls and desires of their own. When Jane Eyre was published in October 1847, the reaction was immediate and enormous. People could not stop talking about it. Here was a novel with a plain, poor, small heroine who refused to accept her assigned place in the world. A woman who said no to a man she loved because marrying him under false pretenses would compromise her integrity. A woman who demanded to be treated as an equal. The famous opening of chapter 23, where Jane confronts Rochester, is extraordinary. She tells him that just because she is poor and plain does not mean she lacks feelings, that she has as much soul and heart as he does, that they are equals in the sight of God. This was revolutionary stuff in 1847. Critics were divided. Some praised the novel's passion and originality. Others were scandalized. They called it coarse, brutal, anti-Christian. One reviewer wrote that if Currer Bell was a woman, she must be one who had long forfeited the society of her own sex. The implication being that no respectable woman could write such things. Meanwhile, Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey were published together by a different publisher in December 1847. Wuthering Heights baffled and horrified most of its initial readers. It was too strange, too violent. Heathcliff was not a romantic hero by any conventional standard. He was cruel, obsessive, bent on revenge. The love between him and Catherine was destructive, all-consuming, utterly outside the bounds of civilized behaviour. Critics called it morbid, disagreeable, a confused and confusing mess. They could not understand what Ellis Bell was trying to do, and Emily, characteristically, did not explain. She never publicly acknowledged being the author. She just continued her quiet life in Holworth, walking the moors with her dogs, baking bread, being strange and silent and utterly herself. Anne's Agnes Grey was largely ignored, overshadowed by the controversy around Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. But it is a remarkable novel in its own quiet way. It tells the truth about the life of a governess with unflinching honesty, no sentimentality, no rescue by a handsome employer, just the daily humiliation and loneliness of being trapped between social classes, belonging nowhere. The mystery of the Bell brothers only deepened. Were they men, women, 3 people, or one person using different names? Publishers and readers were obsessed with figuring it out, and the sisters kept their secret, even as they began working on new novels. Charlotte started Shirley. Anne wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which we'll talk about more later because it is astonishingly radical. And Emily, well, we do not know what Emily might have written next, because in September 1848, their brother Branwell died of tuberculosis, his body ravaged by years of alcohol and opium abuse. Branwell had been the golden child, the boy genius, the one Patrick Bronte pinned all his hopes on. But Branwell fell apart. He failed at every career he attempted. He had an affair with a married woman who employed him as a tutor, and when it ended he spiralled into addiction and despair. His sisters watched him destroy himself, helpless to stop it. At Branwell's funeral, Emily caught a cold. She refused all medical treatment, all attempts to help her. She just kept going, doing her daily tasks, growing thinner and paler, until finally in December 1848 she could no longer stand. She died at noon on the 19th of December on the sofa in the parlour, with Charlotte and Anne beside her. She was 30 years old. Charlotte wrote to a friend that Emily died without ever admitting she was seriously ill, without ever saying she was afraid. She faced death the way she had faced that dog bite, alone, unflinching, refusing comfort. And then, just 5 months later, in May 1849, Anne died of tuberculosis as well. Charlotte took her to Scarborough by the sea, hoping the air would help. But Anne knew she was dying. She was 29 years old, 3 siblings gone in less than a year. Charlotte was left alone with her aging father in that silent parsonage. Can you imagine that grief? Being the last one left? All those shared childhood worlds, all those conversations and collaborations, all those secret jokes and references, gone. Charlotte had to keep living. She had to finish Shirley. She had to answer letters. She had to be the strong one. And she also had to decide what to do about her sisters' reputations. Because now that Emily and Anne were dead, Charlotte felt she needed to explain them to the world, to defend them. And in doing so, she made choices that would shape how we see Emily and Anne for generations. But we will get to that, because next we need to talk about the other sisters, the Fox sisters, whose childhood prank had by now become a full-blown religious movement. We need to see how fame and fortune treated 2 young girls who never asked for it. We need to understand how the double life they were living, revered mediums in public, frightened frauds in private, was starting to crack. And we need to meet some of the people who believed in them, who built their hopes on the idea that death was not the end, that love could reach across the veil between worlds. So stay with me. The night is still young, and these stories are just beginning to reveal their deepest truths. Let us travel now from the windswept moors of Yorkshire to the bustling streets of Rochester, New York, in the year 1849. Picture gaslit avenues, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, newspapers crying out the latest sensations, and crowds gathering outside a grand building called Corinthian Hall. They have come, hundreds of them, clutching their tickets, their faces a mixture of excitement and skepticism. They have come to witness something that defies explanation. They have come to see two teenage girls speak with the dead. Leah Fox understood spectacle. She understood that in America in the mid-19th century, entertainment and enlightenment had become deliciously blurred. This was the age of P.T. Barnum, after all, the showman who displayed the Fiji Mermaid and General Tom Thumb and made millions convincing people that the extraordinary was real. Leah looked at her younger sisters, Maggie and Kate, and she saw opportunity written in the mysterious rapping sounds that followed them wherever they went. But let us back up for a moment, because I want you to understand how quickly this spiraled from a childhood prank into something much larger and stranger. After that first night in March 1848, when the rappings began in the Fox family home in Hydesville, word spread through the small community like wildfire. Neighbours came to investigate. They asked questions, and the spirit answered with knocks. They formed committees to examine the girls, looking for tricks or deception. And here is the fascinating thing. Some people were convinced it was fraud, but they could not prove it. Others became true believers on the spot. The spirit, remember, had identified itself as a murdered peddler buried in the basement. So what did the neighbours do? They started digging, and they did find bones. Human bones, or at least bones that looked human. Later examination would reveal they were probably animal bones, but in the moment it seemed like confirmation. The spirit had told the truth. Therefore, the girls could communicate with the dead. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Fox were deeply religious Methodists, and they were horrified by all of this. They did not want attention. They did not want their home turned into a circus. So they separated the girls, sending them to stay with different relatives. Surely, they thought, the phenomena would stop. It did not stop. Wherever Kate went, the rappings followed. Wherever Maggie went, spirits seemed to gather. And so the girls ended up in Rochester, staying with their older sister Leah. Leah was in her mid-30s, divorced, struggling to make ends meet as a music teacher. She had a daughter to support, and suddenly she had two younger sisters who seemed to possess an extraordinary gift, or an extraordinary talent for performance. Either way, Leah recognized value when she saw it. She started inviting people to her home for sittings, small groups at first, friends, acquaintances, the curious. She did not charge money initially, but she accepted donations. And people came. They came because in 1849, America was hungry for something new, something that bridged the gap between science and religion, between the rational and the mystical. Think about what was happening in the world at that time. The telegraph had just been invented, allowing people to send messages across vast distances instantaneously. Railroads were connecting cities that had once been days apart. Photography was making it possible to capture images, to freeze moments in time. The boundaries of what seemed possible were expanding daily. So when two young girls said they could communicate across the ultimate boundary, the one between life and death, people were primed to believe. It did not seem any more impossible than sending a message from New York to Boston in seconds. It was just another kind of technology, another way of connecting the impossible, and there was something else, something darker and more desperate. The death rate, particularly among children, was staggering. Most families had lost someone, a child, a parent, a sibling. The grief was fresh and raw and ever present. The idea that you could speak to your lost loved ones, that death was not a final severing but merely a transition, that was profoundly comforting. So people came to Leah's home, and they sat in darkened rooms, and they asked questions, and the raps answered, and some people left convinced they had spoken with their dead mothers, their lost children, their beloved husbands. By the fall of 1849, Leah decided it was time to go public in a bigger way. She rented Corinthian Hall, one of Rochester's most prestigious venues. She took out advertisements in the newspapers, and she announced that the Fox sisters would give a demonstration of their abilities, open to public examination and investigation. The advertisement was clever. It positioned the event not as entertainment, but as scientific inquiry. It invited skeptics. It essentially dared people to come and prove the sisters were frauds. This was brilliant marketing because it meant that both believers and doubters would buy tickets. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. On November 14th, 1849, 400 people packed into Corinthian Hall. The audience was a mix of society ladies in their finest dresses, businessmen, clergy, doctors, journalists, and plenty of regular folks who had scraped together the admission price. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The Fox sisters appeared on stage. Maggie was 16 years old. Kate was 12. Leah stood with them, the protective older sister, the manager, the intermediary. The girls looked young, vulnerable, innocent. This was important. If they had been older, more worldly, people might have been more suspicious. But they were children. Surely children could not be master manipulators. The demonstration began simply. People in the audience were invited to ask questions. The spirits would respond with raps. 1 knock for no, 3 knocks for yes. Then they developed a more complex system. Someone would recite the alphabet, and the spirits would rap at the correct letters to spell out words and messages. And the raps came. Clear, loud, seemingly emanating from all around the room. From the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. People were astounded. How were 2 young girls producing these sounds? Committees were formed right there in the hall. Respectable men came up on stage to examine the sisters. They asked the girls to stand on pillows, on glass, to elevate their feet. The rappings continued. One committee concluded that the sounds were indeed produced by the girls themselves, likely through some movement of their joints or feet, but they could not definitively prove how. Another committee declared the phenomena genuine and unexplainable by natural means. The audience was divided, arguing passionately with each other, and the newspapers the next day were filled with debates about the Fox sisters. Now, here is the thing about Kate and Maggie that I find heartbreaking. They were just kids, teenagers who had stumbled into something enormous. Do you remember being 12, being 16? Do you remember how it felt to be that age, caught between childhood and adulthood, trying to figure out who you were? Imagine being Kate, 12 years old, standing on a stage in front of hundreds of strangers, knowing that if you make one wrong move, if the trick is discovered, you and your family will be ruined, possibly prosecuted for fraud. Imagine the pressure, the constant vigilance, the fear, and at the same time imagine the intoxication of it, the applause, the attention, people treating you as special, as extraordinary. After a childhood of poverty and obscurity, suddenly you matter. People want to meet you, to touch you, to be near you. Is it any wonder the girls kept going? Leah, meanwhile, saw dollar signs. After the success at Corinthian Hall, she organized a tour, first to other cities in New York State, then to Philadelphia, then to New York City itself. The Fox sisters became full-time professional mediums. They gave private sittings for wealthy clients who would pay handsomely for the chance to speak with their departed loved ones. They held public demonstrations in theatres and halls. The money started rolling in. Not a fortune by the standards of the truly wealthy, but more money than the Fox family had ever seen. Leah bought a nice house. She dressed the girls in fine clothes. They stayed in good hotels. They were, in their own way, celebrities, but the act required constant refinement, because as they became famous, the scrutiny intensified. More and more people wanted to expose them. Magicians, scientists, journalists, they all tried to figure out the trick. There was a doctor named Charles A. Lee who examined the girls in Buffalo in 1851. He concluded that the raps were produced by the girls cracking the joints in their knees and ankles and toes. He was essentially correct. But when he published his findings, believers dismissed him. They accused him of being biased, of having made up his mind before examining the sisters. The faithful did not want to hear it. And this is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Fox sisters' story. Even when people were presented with evidence of fraud, even when the mechanisms of the trick were explained, many chose not to believe it, because they needed spiritualism to be real. They needed the comfort it provided. By 1850, just 2 years after that first night in Hydesville, there were dozens of mediums operating across America. By 1851, there were hundreds. People from all walks of life claimed they too could communicate with spirits. Spiritualism was becoming a movement, a religion, a cultural phenomenon, and it spread to England. Queen Victoria herself, after the death of her beloved husband Prince Albert in 1861, became fascinated with mediums. She consulted them, hoping to reach Albert beyond the veil. A teenage medium named Robert James Lees supposedly proved his abilities by addressing Victoria with a pet name that only Albert would have known. Whether this was genuine, or whether Lees had done his research and learned the name through more earthly means, we will never know. But Victoria believed. Wealthy Americans and Europeans began hosting séances in their parlours. It became fashionable, a form of entertainment that carried the frisson of the forbidden. The lights would be lowered, everyone would sit around a table, hands linked, and the medium would summon the spirits. Tables would tilt, raps would sound, sometimes objects would move, or voices would speak from the darkness. Most of these mediums were women. Why? Because women were already associated with intuition, with emotion, with the spiritual realm. It was believable that women might have access to supernatural powers, and it gave women a form of authority and income that was otherwise denied to them. A successful medium could earn a good living, could travel, could command respect in a way that was impossible in almost any other profession. The Fox sisters met everyone. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist; James Fenimore Cooper, the novelist; Horace Greeley, the influential newspaper editor, and his wife Mary; Andrew Jackson Davis, a seer and mystic who called himself the John the Baptist of spiritualism, took the girls under his wing. He saw them as proof of his own prophecies, as the ushering in of a new era of spiritual communication. In New York City, they stayed at Barnum's Hotel, owned by a cousin of the great showman P.T. Barnum himself. They performed at venues that charged high ticket prices. They gave private sittings to society ladies who paid $50 for an hour, an enormous sum at the time. But here is what the public did not see. Behind the scenes, Kate and Maggie were exhausted. They were always on, always performing, always having to produce the raps on demand. Leah watched them constantly, managed every aspect of their lives, took a large cut of their earnings, and the girls were starting to crack, Kate especially. She was the younger one, the more sensitive one, the one who had never really wanted any of this. She began to drink, at first just a little, to calm her nerves before performances, but it became a habit and then a dependency. Maggie, meanwhile, met someone who would change her life in ways she could never have anticipated. In 1852, while giving sittings in Philadelphia, she met a man named Elisha Kent Kane. He was 32 years old, an Arctic explorer of some renown, a medical doctor, and a member of a prominent Philadelphia family. And he was utterly skeptical of spiritualism. Kane was convinced that Maggie was being exploited by Leah. He saw a young woman, intelligent and sensitive, trapped in a fraudulent scheme not of her own making, and he fell in love with her. Or perhaps more accurately, he fell in love with the idea of rescuing her. He began courting Maggie in secret. He wrote her passionate letters. He urged her to leave the life of a medium, to confess the fraud, to start fresh. He promised to take care of her, to educate her, to introduce her to his world of science and exploration. And Maggie, who had been performing for years, who'd been controlled and managed and exhibited, fell desperately in love with him. Here was a man who saw her as a person, not as a commodity, who wanted to save her, who offered an escape. But Kane's family was horrified by the idea of him marrying a spiritualist medium. It would be a scandal. It would ruin his reputation. So their relationship remained secret, carried out through letters and clandestine meetings. Kane gave Maggie money to study, to improve herself. He tried to convince her to convert to Catholicism, to publicly renounce spiritualism. But Maggie could not bring herself to do it, because confessing would mean betraying Kate. It would mean destroying Leah's livelihood. It would mean admitting to thousands of people who believed in them that it had all been a lie. The weight of that was too much. Meanwhile, Kate continued to tour and perform. In 1861, she travelled to England, her trip funded by a wealthy New York banker who saw it as missionary work. Kate was to demonstrate spiritualism to the English elite, to spread the movement across the Atlantic. She gave sittings only for prominent people, carefully selected, whose names could be used as testimonials. In London, she met a barrister named H.D. Jenkin, a legal scholar and an absolutely devoted believer in spiritualism. Unlike Kane, who wanted to save Maggie from the movement, Jenkin wanted to elevate Kate within it. He saw her as a genuine medium, a conduit to the divine, and in 1872 they married. So now we have two paths diverging. Maggie, in love with a skeptic who wants her to confess. Kate, married to a true believer who reinforces her role as a medium. And Leah, still managing, still controlling, still profiting from her sister's abilities. The tensions were building. The years of constant performance, of living a double life, of maintaining the fraud while watching more and more people build their hopes and faith upon it. It was taking a toll. Kate's drinking was getting worse. Maggie was caught between love for Kane and loyalty to her sisters, and the world of spiritualism was growing ever larger, with millions of followers who needed to believe. Something was going to break. The question was not if, but when, and how spectacular the collapse would be. But before we get to that breaking point, we need to understand the methods. We need to see exactly how the Fox sisters and the hundreds of mediums who followed them created their illusions. Because the techniques were sophisticated, the psychology was brilliant, and the willingness of people to believe was profound. So let us pull back the curtain and examine the art of Victorian deception. Every magician knows that the real magic is not in the trick itself, but in understanding human nature, what people want to believe, what they need to see. And in the dimly lit parlours and grand theatres of Victorian America and England, An entire industry was built on this understanding. The mediums were not just frauds, they were psychologists, performers, and in their own way, artists of human longing. So how did they do it? How did the Fox sisters and the hundreds of mediums who followed them create the illusion of communication with the dead? Let us pull back the curtain and examine the methods, because they are far more sophisticated than you might imagine. The foundation of the Fox Sisters Act was, as we have mentioned, the rapping sounds. And the secret was remarkably simple. They crack their joints, specifically the joints in their toes, their ankles, their knees. If you have ever cracked your knuckles, you know the sound. Now imagine learning to do that with your toes, with enough force that the sound resonates through the floor, through the walls, seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Kate and Maggie practiced this for years. They developed extraordinary control over the muscles in their feet and legs. They could produce single raps or rapid-fire sequences. They could make the sounds loud or soft, near or far. And because they wore the long, heavy skirts that Victorian fashion demanded, no one could see their feet move. The fabric concealed everything. There is a man I want to tell you about. His name was Elihu E. Page, and he was a doctor in Troy, New York. In 1850, he became obsessed with figuring out how the Fox sisters produced their raps. He examined them multiple times, and he came to understand the mechanism. He even built contraptions that could replicate the sounds using springs and levers hidden under clothing. He published his findings, explaining in detail how the trick worked. But here is the fascinating part. Nobody cared. The believers dismissed Page as a closed-minded skeptic. They said he was threatened by the spiritual revolution the Fox sisters represented. They accused him of jealousy, of being stuck in old materialistic thinking. His explanations, no matter how accurate, could not compete with the emotional need people had to believe. And that emotional need was profound. Imagine you're a mother who has lost a child to scarlet fever. Your little girl was 5 years old, laughing and playing 1 week, burning with fever the next, dead within days. The grief is crushing. You would give anything, pay anything, to know that she still exists somewhere, that she is safe and happy, that you will see her again. Then you hear about a medium who can contact the dead. You attend a séance. The lights are low. The medium goes into a trance. And then, through raps or through the medium's voice, a message comes. It mentions your daughter's name. It references a toy she loved, a song she used to sing. It tells you that she is at peace, that she loves you, that she is waiting for you in heaven. Are you going to question whether this is real? Are you going to demand scientific proof? Or are you going to clutch at this comfort with both hands and hold on for dear life? The mediums understood this psychology intimately, and they developed techniques to exploit it, techniques that mentalists and psychics still use today. It is called cold reading. You gather information beforehand. You make educated guesses based on clothing, age, accent, body language. You phrase statements as questions. You let the subject fill in the details and then reflect those details back as if the spirits provided them. For example, a medium might say something vague like, "I am sensing a presence, someone whose name begins with M, or perhaps a J." Now think about how many people in anyone's life have names beginning with M or J. Mary, Margaret, Michael, James, John, Joseph, Jane. The odds are excellent that the sitter will say, "Oh yes, my mother Mary," or "my uncle James," and then the medium says, "Yes, Mary is here. She has a message for you." The medium has not actually said anything specific. The sitter provided the information, but in the emotional intensity of the moment, It feels like genuine communication from beyond. The Fox sisters employed another technique that was brilliantly simple. They would have people in the audience call out the alphabet, and the spirit would rap at the correct letters to spell out messages. But watch how this works. The person is calling out letters A, B, C, D. The medium waits. When they get to the right letter, the rap sounds E, F, G, another rap. Now, the medium is controlling when the raps occur, but the audience member is providing the letters. So if a message comes through that says "Mother loves you," it feels collaborative, co-created, rather than dictated by the medium. And if the message is generic enough, it applies to almost everyone. But the Fox sisters were just the beginning. As spiritualism spread, the techniques became more elaborate. Other mediums introduced new phenomena. There was table tipping, where everyone would sit around a table with their hands lightly touching the surface, and the table would seem to move on its own, tilting, lifting, even sliding across the floor. The trick: subtle pressure. If you have ever played with a Ouija board, you know this effect. Everyone swears they are not moving it, and in a sense, they are telling the truth. They are not consciously moving it. But tiny unconscious muscle movements, multiplied across several people, create real motion. The medium simply has to know how to guide these movements through suggestion and expectation. Then there was automatic writing. The medium would hold a pencil loosely, go into a trance, and their hand would begin to write messages supposedly from spirits. This is actually a well-documented psychological phenomenon called the ideomotor effect. Your hand can move without conscious control, especially when you are in a relaxed or suggestible state. Mediums trained themselves to let this happen while subtly guiding what was written. Some mediums produced what they called spirit materializations. Objects would appear out of thin air. Flowers would fall from the ceiling. Musical instruments would play themselves. These effects required more elaborate stagecraft, hidden compartments in furniture, confederates in the audience, apparatus concealed under clothing. The Davenport brothers, Ira and William, became famous in the 1850s for their cabinet act. They would be tied up inside a wooden cabinet, and then musical instruments inside would play, bells would ring, ghostly hands would appear through openings in the wood. Magicians and skeptics repeatedly exposed the Davenport brothers' methods. They were using quick-release knots, contorting their bodies to free their hands, manipulating the instruments themselves. But the brothers never admitted to trickery. They simply said that spirits were responsible for the phenomena, and their followers believed them. The most elaborate mediums produced full-body apparitions, ghostly figures draped in white cloth, glowing in the darkness, seemingly floating through the séance room. These were almost always accomplished using accomplices dressed in white muslin treated with phosphorescent paint, which would glow eerily in the dark. Wires and pulleys allowed them to seem to float. Trapdoors and hidden panels allowed them to appear and disappear. One of the most famous spirit photographers was a man named William Mumler in the 1860s. He claimed that when he took photographs, the spirits of the dead would appear in the images alongside the living subjects. Grieving people flocked to him, desperate for a photograph with their departed loved ones. Mary Todd Lincoln, after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, had her photograph taken by Mumler and believed she saw the spirit of her husband standing behind her in the image. How did Mumler do it? Double exposure. He would photograph someone, then later photograph someone else on the same plate, creating a ghostly transparent second figure. Sometimes he would use photographs of people who had died, superimposing them into the images. It was clever darkroom work, nothing more. but it provided tremendous comfort to those who received these pictures. Mumler was eventually put on trial for fraud in 1869. Photographers testified about how double exposures worked. Magicians demonstrated the techniques. But Mumler was acquitted, largely because the jury felt sympathy for the bereaved people who testified that his photographs had brought them peace. And this gets at something important. Were these mediums cruel con artists preying on the vulnerable? Or were they providing a genuine service, offering comfort in an age of staggering death rates and limited understanding of grief counselling? The answer, I think, is complicated. Some mediums were absolutely cynical frauds, in it purely for the money, manipulating desperate people with no remorse. But others seem to have believed, at least partially, in what they were doing. They saw themselves as facilitators, helping people connect with their own need for closure and comfort. The boundary between fraud and faith, between deception and self-deception, was often blurry. There is a phenomenon psychologists call pious fraud. It means lying for a good cause. A medium might think, yes, I am creating these effects through trickery, but I'm helping people heal. I am giving them hope. Does it matter if the mechanism is supernatural or psychological, if the comfort is real? Now, let us talk about another layer of the deception, one that is particularly relevant to our story. The Victorian parlour game called Polari, or Polare. This was a kind of coded language used by various subcultures, actors, circus performers, criminals, and notably, men who loved other men at a time when homosexuality was illegal. Why does this matter? Because the world of spiritualism and Victorian performance was tightly interconnected. Mediums knew magicians, they shared techniques, they attended each other's shows, and some of them used coded language to communicate with Confederates in the audience without being detected. A medium might have an assistant who would mingle with the audience before a show, striking up conversations, gathering information. The assistant would learn that Mrs. Smith recently lost her husband, that Mr. Jones is worried about his business, that Miss Brown had a sister who died in childhood. Then, during the performance, the assistant would feed this information to the medium using pre-arranged signals or coded phrases. The audience saw a miracle. The medium saw backstage preparation and teamwork. But the most powerful technique of all was something that required no apparatus, no Confederates, no special effects. It was simply paying attention. The best mediums were extraordinary observers of human behavior. They noticed a wedding ring on a chain around someone's neck, suggesting a widow. They saw mourning clothes, heard a catch in someone's voice when certain topics were mentioned, observed the photographs or trinkets people carried. Sherlock Holmes, that fictional detective created by Arthur Conan Doyle, was based in part on a real person. Dr. Joseph Bell, one of Doyle's medical school professors, was famous for making seemingly impossible deductions about patients based on tiny details. He could tell their occupation, their hometown, their recent activities just by observation. Mediums used the same skills, but they presented their observations as messages from spirits, and in the emotional atmosphere of a séance, with dim lights and earnest expectation, it was remarkably effective. I want to tell you about one more case, because it illustrates the complexity of belief and deception in spiritualism. There was a medium named Leonora Piper who operated in Boston in the late 1800s. She was investigated extensively by the American Society for Psychical Research. They sent anonymous sitters to her. They moved her to England to eliminate any possibility of her having local informants. They watched her constantly, and she was astonishingly accurate. She provided information that seemed impossible for her to know through normal means. Even hardened skeptics came away puzzled. William James, the pioneering psychologist, studied her for years and concluded that either she had genuine psychic abilities or she was the most remarkable fraud he had ever encountered. He could not decide which. Later analysis suggests that Piper was probably using a combination of cold reading, information gathering through Confederates, and the ideomotor effect. But she was so skilled that even today, researchers debate whether there might have been something genuinely anomalous about her abilities. The point is that these were not simple tricks performed by obvious charlatans. These were sophisticated psychological operations carried out by people who deeply understood how humans think, feel, and grieve. The mediums were, in many cases, more insightful about human nature than the scientists and doctors who tried to expose them. And the Fox sisters? By the 1870s and 1880s they were still performing, but the strain was showing. Kate's drinking had become serious. Maggie had married Alicia Kent Kane in a secret ceremony, or at least she claimed they had married. Kane died in 1857, and his family denied the marriage, cutting Maggie off from any inheritance. She returned to mediumship, bitter and conflicted. The techniques they used had not changed much. Still the rappings, still the alphabet calling, still the same old methods. But they were aging. The novelty had worn off. Newer mediums with more spectacular effects were drawing the crowds. The Fox sisters were becoming relics of an earlier, simpler time in spiritualism, and Kate was struggling. Her husband, H.D. Jenkin, died in 1881, leaving her alone with 2 young sons. Her drinking worsened. Leah, ever protective of the spiritualism brand, began to worry that Kate's behavior would expose them all. She made moves to have Kate's children taken away, claiming Kate was an unfit mother. This was the breaking point. This was the moment when decades of resentment, of living a double life, of being controlled and exhibited and used, finally reached a crisis. Kate and Maggie had had enough of Leah, enough of the lies, enough of pretending. And so, in 1888, 40 years after those first rappings in Hydesville, Maggie Fox agreed to do something extraordinary, something that would shock the world and supposedly deal a death blow to the spiritualism movement she'd created. She agreed to confess. But confessions, as we'll see, are complicated things, and the fallout from Maggie's revelation would be stranger and sadder than anyone could have predicted. Let us turn now to that dramatic night in October 1888, when everything came crashing down. The New York World newspaper hit the streets on the morning of October 21st, 1888, with a headline that stopped the city in its tracks. Spiritualism exposed, it declared. And underneath, in smaller but no less shocking type, Maggie Fox Kane confesses all. The rappings were a fraud from beginning to end. For readers who had followed the Fox sisters' story for 40 years, who had perhaps attended their seances, who had built their understanding of death and the afterlife on the foundation these sisters laid, this was cataclysmic. It was as if someone had announced that gravity was optional, that the sun might not rise, that everything they thought they knew was built on sand. But the newspaper article was just the preview. The main event was scheduled for that very evening at the New York Academy of Music. Maggie Fox Kane had agreed to appear on stage, before a paying audience, to demonstrate exactly how she and her sister Kate had fooled the world. The theatre sold out within hours. 1,500 tickets gone in a frenzy of curiosity, outrage, and morbid fascination. Think about what this moment meant. Imagine spending 40 years of your life performing a role, maintaining a deception, living inside a lie that has become bigger than you ever imagined, and then choosing to step out into the light and say, it was all false, every single bit of it. What drives someone to that point? Is it courage or desperation? Revenge or redemption? For Maggie Fox, it was probably all of these things tangled together. The backstory to this confession is messy and human and sad. Maggie was 55 years old in 1888. Her life had been difficult. After Elisha Kent Kane died in 1857, his wealthy family had rejected her claim to be his widow. They refused to acknowledge the marriage, refused to give her any financial support. She had returned to working as a medium, but her heart was never fully in it. Kane had tried to convince her to confess, to leave spiritualism behind, and part of her had always wanted to honor that. Meanwhile, Kate's life had spiraled into real trouble. After her husband Jenkin died in 1881, she was left alone with 2 young sons and a serious drinking problem. The spiritualist community, which had once celebrated her, now looked at her with concern and judgment. And Leah, the controlling older sister who had managed Kate and Maggie's careers for decades, decided something had to be done. Leah was worried that Kate's alcoholism would bring scandal to the spiritualism movement, so she began working behind the scenes to have Kate declared an unfit mother, to have her children taken away from her. This was not just cruelty, though it was certainly cruel. Leah genuinely believed she was protecting the children and protecting the movement that had given them all a livelihood for 40 years. But to Kate and Maggie, this was the ultimate betrayal. Leah had controlled them since they were children. She had pushed them onto stages when they were frightened. She had taken the majority of their earnings. She had shaped their entire lives around maintaining the fraud. And now she was going after Kate's children. That was the breaking point. Kate and Maggie decided to strike back, and the weapon they chose was the truth. A reporter from the New York World approached Maggie with an offer, $1,500 in exchange for a full confession and a public demonstration. That was an enormous sum of money, roughly equivalent to $40,000 today. For Maggie, who was living in poverty, it was irresistible. But the money was not the only motivation. She wanted to hurt Leah. She wanted to expose the lie they had all been living. And perhaps, after all these years, she wanted to be free. Kate agreed to support her. She would be in the audience on the night of the confession, a silent witness to her sister's revelation. So picture the New York Academy of Music on the evening of October 21st. The theatre is packed, every seat filled, people standing in the aisles. The audience is a mix of true believers who have come to defend spiritualism, skeptics who have waited decades for this vindication, journalists scribbling notes, and ordinary New Yorkers who just want to witness history. The atmosphere is electric, almost violent. People are shouting at each other before the show even begins. Believers are calling the whole thing a setup, a lie, claiming Maggie is being paid to slander the movement. Skeptics are triumphant, saying they knew it was fraud all along. The New York Herald, reporting on the event, said the crowd hummed with the wildest excitement. Then Maggie appeared on stage. She was dressed entirely in black, still in mourning for Kane even though he had been dead for more than 30 years. She wore heavy-rimmed glasses on a black cord. She looked older than her 55 years. The years of struggle, the alcoholism that she shared with Kate, the weight of carrying this secret, all of it showed in her gaunt face and tired eyes. She carried a written statement, and she began to read. Her voice was steady, but you could hear the emotion underneath. "The greatest sorrow of my life," she said, "has been that this is not the first time I've been called upon to denounce spiritualism. I have had to do it privately, again and again, but it is a late day now, and I am prepared to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God." Can you imagine the courage it took to say those words? In front of 1,500 people, many of them hostile, knowing that this would change everything, that there was no going back. She continued reading. She explained that she and Kate had been very young children when it all began, that they had started the wrappings as a prank, tying an apple to a string and bouncing it on the floor to scare their mother, that when people believed it was spirits they were too frightened to confess, and that once Leah took control, there was no escape. "We were but children," Maggie said, "and knew no better. But we were led on by my sister Leah. She was the one who insisted we continue. She managed us, controlled us, profited from us, and now, in my mature years, I am prepared to state, in the most public and emphatic manner, that spiritualism is a fraud from beginning to end, a cursed fraud, the wickedness of which has brought untold misery to thousands." The believers in the audience were shouting now. Some were sobbing. Others were yelling that she was lying, that she'd been bribed, that this was a conspiracy. But Maggie was not finished. She put down her written statement and looked out at the crowd. Then she did something extraordinary. She asked for a small wooden stool to be brought onto the stage. She sat down, removed her right shoe, and placed her foot, clad only in a black stocking, onto the stool where everyone could see. And then she demonstrated. She flexed her foot in a particular way, and a loud, clear rap sounded through the theatre. The audience gasped. She did it again. Rap. Again. Rap, rap, rap. She could control the rhythm, the volume, the spacing of the sounds. She called out to a man in the front row and asked him to place his hand against her foot so he could feel the movement. He confirmed that he could feel the vibrations in her joints, the subtle motions that produced the raps. For many in the audience, this was definitive proof. They could see and hear exactly how it was done. The mystery that had captivated millions for 4 decades was solved in a matter of seconds by an aging woman cracking her toe joints on a stage. But what is fascinating is that not everyone believed the confession. Some spiritualists immediately declared it was Maggie who was lying now, not 40 years ago. They said she was drunk, confused, being manipulated by enemies of the movement. They pointed out that she was being paid for the confession, so obviously it could not be trusted. Others developed elaborate explanations. They said that perhaps the early wrappings had been produced by Maggie and Kate's joints, but that real spirits had later used this mechanism to communicate, that the girls had been genuine mediums who just happened to use a physical method to facilitate spirit contact. The mental gymnastics people perform to avoid accepting the confession tells you something important about human psychology. When a belief is central to your identity, when it provides comfort and meaning to your life, evidence against it is not always enough to change your mind. Sometimes it just makes you defend the belief more fiercely. Kate was sitting in a box seat that night watching her sister on stage. According to newspaper reports, she applauded when Maggie finished. She stood and bowed to the audience, lending her silent support to the confession. For Kate, this was an act of solidarity, of saying, "Yes, my sister speaks the truth, and I stand with her against Leah." But Kate's support was complicated, because unlike Maggie, who seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth, Kate was conflicted. She had 2 young sons to support. Her income came from spiritualism. Her husband had been a true believer who revered her as a genuine medium. What would it mean for his memory, for their children's understanding of their father, if she fully embraced the confession? The New York Herald, in its coverage the next day, said that the evening had been both ludicrous and weird, that spiritualism could never recover from this crushing blow. But the New York world was more cynical. They predicted that spiritualistic impostors would continue to find as many fools as ever and continue to make their cheats profitable. Which prediction proved accurate? Both, in a way. The confession did damage the reputations of Maggie and Kate Fox personally. Their bookings dropped off. Many spiritualists denounced them as traitors, but the movement itself, it barely slowed down. By 1897, less than 10 years after the confession, spiritualism claimed over 8 million followers in the United States alone. Lily Dale, the spiritualist community in upstate New York that had been founded in 1879, continued to thrive. Mediums continued to give sittings. Seances remained popular. People still desperately wanted to believe that death was not the end, that they could reach their loved ones beyond the veil. And here is where the story takes an even stranger turn. In 1889, less than a year after her dramatic confession, Maggie recanted. She published a statement saying that she'd been pressured into the confession, that she'd been drinking heavily at the time, that her denunciation of spiritualism was false. She claimed that she and Kate truly had possessed the ability to communicate with spirits. Why would she do this? Some historians believe she was pressured by spiritualists who made it clear she would have no income if she maintained her confession. Others think she genuinely regretted betraying the movement and the people who had believed in her. Still others suggest that she could not bear the weight of having destroyed the legacy she and Kate had built, even if that legacy was based on fraud. Whatever her reasons, the recantation further muddied the waters. Now people could choose to believe whichever version they preferred. If you wanted to think spiritualism was real, you could point to the recantation and say Maggie had been coerced into the false confession. If you wanted to think it was fraud, you could point to the original confession and say the recantation was the lie. The truth, I think, is that Maggie herself no longer knew what was real. After 40 years of living inside a performance, of being both the deceiver and the deceived, the lines had become impossibly blurred. She had spent so long being someone else that her authentic self had disappeared somewhere along the way. Kate never made a public statement either way. She continued to work occasionally as a medium, but her alcoholism worsened. She died on July 2nd, 1892, at the age of 56, alone and impoverished. Maggie survived her by less than a year, dying on March 8th, 1893, at 59. Both women died in poverty, in obscurity, their final years marked by illness and addiction and regret. And Leah? She had died in 1890, before Kate and Maggie. She died still defending spiritualism, still maintaining that her sisters had been genuine mediums, still collecting income from her role as a spiritualist elder. She never acknowledged the confession, never admitted to manipulating her younger sisters, never showed any public remorse. So what are we to make of all this? The confession and the recantation, the believers who refused to accept evidence, the brief moment when the truth seemed clear before it dissolved again into ambiguity. I think the Fox sisters' story shows us something profound about the nature of truth and belief. It shows us that facts alone are often not enough to change minds, that people need their beliefs the way they need food and shelter. That comfort can matter more than truth, and that living a double life, maintaining a performance for decades, exacts a terrible psychological toll. But there is another thread to this story that we have not fully explored yet. The thread of love. Maggie and Alicia Kent Kane, Kate and H.D. Mencken, Charlotte Bronte and Constantine Heger. These relationships were all shaped by the double lives these women were living. Love became entangled with secrecy, with rescue fantasies, with the desperate need to be seen and known as you truly are. And that is where we turn our attention next, to the hearts hidden behind the masks, to the price of loving someone when you're not allowed to be yourself. When you're living a double life, when the person you show the world is fundamentally different from who you truly are, how do you let someone love you? How do you open your heart when your entire existence is a performance? This is the question that haunted every one of our sisters, and the answers they found were as varied and complicated as love itself. Philadelphia in the winter of 1852 was cold and elegant, a city of brick townhouses and gas lamps, of society balls and scientific lectures. Maggie Fox was 19 years old, performing séances in a fashionable parlour when she met Dr. Elisha Kent Kane. He was 32, already famous as an Arctic explorer, a man who had survived freezing temperatures and near starvation in his quest to find the lost Franklin expedition. He was handsome, educated, charming, and from one of Philadelphia's most prominent families, and he thought spiritualism was complete nonsense. Kane attended one of Maggie's séances as a skeptic determined to expose her. But something unexpected happened. He looked at this young woman, barely more than a girl really, producing her raps and speaking in the voice of spirits, and instead of seeing a fraud, he saw a victim. He convinced himself that Maggie was being manipulated by her sister Leah, that she was trapped in a situation not of her own making, that she needed to be rescued. This is important to understand. Kane did not fall in love with who Maggie was. He fell in love with who he thought she could become if only he could save her. He began writing to her, passionate, intense letters urging her to leave spiritualism, to confess the fraud, to start a new life with his help. He promised to educate her, to introduce her to his world of science and culture, to transform her into someone his family could accept. In his mind, this was romance. In reality, it was something more complicated, a rescue fantasy, a desire to reshape another person into your ideal. And Maggie? She fell desperately in love with him, not just because he was handsome and accomplished, though he was both, but because he was the first person in years who seemed to see her as something other than a commodity, who wanted to know her thoughts, her feelings, her true self beneath the performance. After years of being managed by Leah, of being exhibited like a curiosity, Kane's attention felt like freedom. But there was a problem, several problems actually. Kane's family was horrified by the idea of him associating with a spiritualist medium. His mother in particular saw Maggie as a scandalous fortune-teller who would destroy her son's reputation. They pressured him to end the relationship, and Kane, for all his brave exploration of the Arctic, was not brave enough to defy his family. So the relationship continued in secret. Stolen meetings, coded letters. Kane gave Maggie money to attend a Catholic school, trying to educate her into respectability. He urged her to convert to Catholicism, thinking this would distance her from spiritualism and make her more acceptable to his family. And Maggie, eager to please him, tried. She studied. She attended Mass. She did everything he asked. But she could not bring herself to make the final confession he wanted, because confessing that spiritualism was fraud would mean betraying Kate. It would mean destroying Leah's livelihood and the income that supported their aging father. It would mean admitting to thousands of people that she had been lying to them for years. The weight of that was too much. Kane's letters from this period are painful to read. He alternates between passionate declarations of love and frustrated demands that she prove herself worthy of him by renouncing spiritualism. In one letter, he writes about how she must choose between him and her life as a medium, between truth and deception, between his world and hers. This is not a love that sees and accepts. This is a love that demands transformation as the price of acceptance. In 1857, Kane embarked on another Arctic expedition. Before he left, he allegedly married Maggie in a secret ceremony, or so Maggie claimed. There were no witnesses, no official record, just Maggie's word that they had exchanged vows privately. Kane's family would later deny that any marriage took place, calling Maggie a liar and a schemer. Kane died in Cuba in February 1857 on his way home from the Arctic. He was only 37 years old, and Maggie was left alone, claiming to be his widow but unable to prove it, denied any inheritance by his family, thrust back into the world of spiritualism she had tried to leave behind. For the rest of her life, more than 30 years, Maggie wore black in mourning for Kane. She kept his letters, treasured them, read them over and over. She never remarried. She loved him, or the idea of him, until her death. But it was a love that had required her to deny herself, to become someone she was not, and that had ultimately left her more alone than before. Now, contrast this with Kate's experience. Kate Fox met Henry Dietrich Jenkin in London in the early 1870s. She was in her mid-30s by then, touring England as a medium, her reputation still intact. Jenkin was a barrister, a legal scholar, and unlike Kane, he was a passionate believer in spiritualism. He did not want to save Kate from her gift. He wanted to celebrate it. He saw her mediumship as genuine, as sacred even. When he proposed marriage, it was not conditional on her giving up spiritualism, it was because of it. He wanted to be married to a medium, to be part of the spiritual movement, to help spread the message that death was not the end. They married in 1872, and by all accounts the early years were happy. Jenkin supported Kate's work. He defended her against skeptics. He wrote articles and gave lectures about spiritualism. He never demanded that she be anyone other than who she was. But here is the tragedy. Who Kate was included the secret, the fraud, the performance. And Jenkin loved her for something that was not real. His devotion was based on a lie. Did Kate feel guilty about this? Did she wish she could tell him the truth? Or had she lived the performance so long that she could no longer separate the medium from the woman? We do not know. Kate left fewer letters than Maggie, fewer glimpses into her inner life. But we know that after Jenkin died in 1881, Kate's drinking spiraled out of control. We know that she struggled to maintain her identity as a medium while raising her 2 sons alone. We know that when Maggie confessed in 1888, Kate supported her, suggesting that perhaps she too was tired of the lie. What does it mean to be loved for a persona you've created? Is it better than Kane's conditional love that demanded transformation? Or is it worse, because the person who claims to love you has never seen your true self? These are not easy questions, and our sisters did not find easy answers. Let us turn now to Charlotte Bronte and Constantin Hager, because this is a different kind of love story, a love that was impossible from the start, that existed mostly in letters and longing, that could never be consummated or acknowledged, but that shaped everything Charlotte wrote. Charlotte was 26 years old when she went to Brussels in 1842 to study at the Pensionnat Hager. She was small, plain by conventional standards, painfully shy in social situations but fierce and passionate on the page. She had spent years as a governess, years watching her creative ambitions wither in the daily grind of caring for other people's children. Brussels was supposed to be her escape, her chance to learn languages and eventually open her own school. Constantin Hager was the husband of the woman who ran the school, Madame Claire Zoe Hager. He was a literature professor, brilliant and demanding, someone who took teaching seriously. He read Charlotte's essays and saw past the awkward French to the real talent underneath. He challenged her. He debated with her. He treated her intelligence as something valuable. and Charlotte, starved for this kind of intellectual engagement, fell in love. It is important to understand that this was not a physical affair. Charlotte's moral code would not have allowed it. Hagar was married with children. Adultery was unthinkable to Charlotte, a sin that horrified her. But emotional infidelity, the heart's betrayal even while the body remains virtuous, that was something she could not control. She stayed in Brussels for over a year, drinking in every conversation with Hagar, every critique of her writing, every moment of connection. And then she had to return to England, and the separation nearly destroyed her. Charlotte's letters to Hagar after she left Brussels are among the most revealing documents we have about her inner life. She wrote to him in French, pleading for him to write back, counting the days between his increasingly rare responses. She tried to sound casual, to mask her desperation, but the longing bleeds through every line. In one letter, she writes about how a single word from him would keep her going for 6 months. She describes the pain of waiting for letters that do not come. She tries to rationalize her feelings, to convince herself that what she feels is just the natural affection of a student for a gifted teacher. But the intensity of emotion makes it clear this is much more. Madame Hagar eventually noticed the correspondence and put a stop to it. She understood what Charlotte either could not or would not acknowledge, that Charlotte was in love with her husband, and whether Hagar reciprocated those feelings or simply enjoyed the admiration of a talented student, it had to end. Charlotte returned to the parsonage in Haworth, heartbroken and humiliated. She had allowed herself to feel things she should not feel for a married man. She had exposed her heart and been rejected, and she could never tell anyone about it. Not her sisters, not her friends, certainly not her father. It was her secret shame, her double life, the proper Victorian woman on the outside, the passionate, yearning, almost rebellious heart on the inside. But she channeled all of that pain into Jane Eyre. The relationship between Jane and Rochester is, in many ways, Charlotte's fantasy of how things could have been different. Rochester is also an employer, also older and more experienced than Jane, but he is free to love her. He proposes marriage. He wants her with an intensity that matches her own feelings. Of course, Rochester is also hiding a secret, his mad wife locked in the attic. The revelation of this secret destroys the possibility of marriage and forces Jane to flee. And Jane's response, her refusal to become Rochester's mistress even though she loves him desperately, her insistence on maintaining her moral integrity even at the cost of her own happiness. This is Charlotte working through her own situation. Jane ultimately returns to Rochester only after his wife has died, after he's been humbled and injured, after they can meet as equals with no barriers between them. It is wish fulfillment, yes, but it is also Charlotte insisting that love must be honest, must be between equals, must not require the sacrifice of one's principles. There is a scene in Jane Eyre that I think captures this perfectly. Jane has just learned about the existence of Rochester's wife. She's preparing to leave Thornfield, and Rochester begs her to stay as his mistress. He argues that his marriage to Bertha was a mistake, that he does not love her, that their union is meaningless. He offers Jane a life of luxury and devotion in France, where no one will know their history, and Jane, heartbroken but resolute, refuses. She explains that if she stayed under those circumstances, she would hate herself, that she would lose her self-respect, that laws and principles exist for a reason, and she will not violate them even for the man she loves. This is Charlotte speaking through Jane. This is Charlotte saying, "I loved a married man, but I did not act on it. I maintained my integrity even though it cost me everything. After Heger, Charlotte did eventually marry. In 1854, at the age of 38, she accepted a proposal from Arthur Bell Nichols, her father's curate. Nichols had been devoted to her for years, patient and steadfast. He was not brilliant like Heger. He was not an intellectual equal, but he was kind, and he was available, and he loved her without conditions. Charlotte's letters suggest the marriage was happy, or at least content. She wrote to friends about finding unexpected joy in married life. But there is a wistfulness too, a sense that this was not the grand passion she had once imagined. Nichols loved her, but he did not understand her mind the way Heger had. He burned many of her letters and manuscripts after her death, trying to protect her reputation, destroying evidence of her inner life. Charlotte died just 9 months after her wedding, possibly of complications from pregnancy, possibly of tuberculosis, possibly both. She was 38 years old, and her brief marriage, whatever comfort it provided, could not erase the years of longing for a love that had been impossible from the start. So what do these love stories tell us about our sisters and their double lives? They tell us that love complicated everything, that the Victorian rules about propriety in marriage created situations where genuine connection was nearly impossible, that some of these women loved men who wanted to change them, while others loved men who loved a false version of them, while still others loved men they could never have. And they tell us that the heart does not care about the rules, that you can know something is impossible, can know it is wrong or futile or destructive, and still feel it with every fibre of your being. That love and longing can exist alongside duty and deception, that the double life extends all the way down into the most intimate chambers of the heart. But love was not the only force shaping these women's lives. There was also the relentless machinery of fame and public spectacle, the constant performance, the pressure of being celebrated and scrutinized and commodified, and for young women thrust into the spotlight without preparation or protection, that pressure could be crushing. So let us examine now what it meant to be a celebrity in the Victorian age, and what price our sisters paid for their fame. Fame in the 21st century comes with publicists and security teams, with social media managers and carefully curated images. But fame in the Victorian era, that was a different beast entirely, raw, unfiltered, often brutal. And when that fame came to children, to young women with no infrastructure to protect them, the results could be devastating. Imagine being Kate Fox at 12 years old. 1 month you're an ordinary child in a small town, playing pranks on your mother, living in obscurity. The next month you're standing on a stage in front of 400 strangers who are debating whether you are a miracle or a fraud, whether you should be celebrated or prosecuted. There is no gradual adjustment, no preparation, just the sudden, violent glare of public attention. Kate and Maggie Fox became what we would today call viral sensations. Newspapers across America printed stories about them. Editorials debated their authenticity. Cartoons mocked or celebrated them. People they had never met had strong opinions about whether they were genuine mediums or clever charlatans. Their names were known from New York to California, from London to Paris, and they were children. Children who should have been playing with dolls or learning arithmetic or daydreaming about their futures. Instead, they were performing under intense scrutiny, night after night, knowing that one slip, one moment where the trick was exposed could destroy everything. The money was substantial. A successful séance for a wealthy client could bring in $50 for a single sitting, which would be equivalent to about $1,500 today. Over the course of a year, the Fox sisters could earn thousands of dollars, an astonishing sum for working-class women in the 1850s. Leah made sure they stayed in nice hotels, wore fashionable clothes, presented the image of success and respectability. But who controlled that money? Leah did. She managed every aspect of their careers, took the largest share of their earnings, made all the decisions about where they would perform and for whom. Kate and Maggie had income but no real financial independence. They were assets to be managed, not autonomous individuals making their own choices. Think about what this does to a person's development. Your sister controls your schedule, your finances, your public image. You cannot make a move without her approval. You cannot even stop performing because too many people depend on the income. Your childhood is not your own. Your adolescence is spent in hotel rooms and theatres, always performing, always watched. Is it any wonder that both Kate and Maggie turned to alcohol as adults? Addiction is often about trying to numb pain, to create a space where you can escape the demands placed upon you. For Kate especially, drinking became a way to cope with the constant pressure, the perpetual performance. Now let us talk about Charlotte Bronte's experience of fame, because it was completely different and yet similarly complicated. When Jane Eyre was published in October 1847, it became an immediate bestseller. The first edition sold out in 3 months. A second edition was printed, then a third. People were obsessed with it. Who was this Currer Bell? The novel was too passionate, too knowledgeable about female desire and anger to be written by a man, many critics thought, but too unconventional to be written by a respectable woman. The speculation became intense. Publishers received letters asking about Currer Bell's identity. Reviewers debated it in print. Society gossips discussed it at parties. And Charlotte, living quietly in the parsonage at Haworth with her father and sisters, read all of this with a mixture of pride and terror. She wanted recognition for her work. What writer does not? But she also knew that revealing herself as a woman would change how the novel was read and judged. It would expose her to a level of scrutiny and potential scandal that she was not sure she could handle. The situation became more complicated when Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey were published by a different publisher. Now there were 3 Bell brothers producing novels, and the confusion intensified. Some people thought all 3 books were written by the same person under different pseudonyms. Others speculated that the Bells were a family of brothers collaborating. Then, in 1848, Anne's second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was published, and the publisher did something underhanded. He tried to sell the American rights to the book by implying that Acton Bell and Currer Bell were the same person, that this new novel was by the author of the sensationally successful Jane Eyre. Charlotte's publisher, Smith, Elder and Company, was understandably upset about this deception. So Charlotte made a decision. She and Anne would go to London and reveal themselves to Charlotte's publisher, proving they were 2 separate people. Not 3 brothers, but 2 sisters. This was July 1848. Charlotte was 32 years old. Anne was 28. Neither had ever been to London before. Neither had any experience navigating the world of publishing and high society. They took the night train from Yorkshire, arrived in London early in the morning, and went directly to the offices of Smith, Elder and Company at 65 Cornhill. They asked to see Mr. George Smith. When he came out, Charlotte handed him a letter he had written to Currer Bell. She said quietly, "Where did you get this?" Can you imagine the moment? George Smith, expecting to meet a mysterious male author, finding instead 2 small, plainly dressed women standing in his office. He was shocked, delighted but shocked. He immediately saw the publicity value of the revelation, while also understanding the sisters' desire for privacy. Smith took them under his wing for the few days they were in London. He introduced them to his mother and sisters. He took them to the opera, to the Royal Academy, to meet other writers and editors, and Charlotte found herself thrust into a world she'd only read about in books. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. She wrote to her friend Mary Taylor describing the experience, how she felt like a country bumpkin in the elegant London drawing rooms, how she was tongue-tied in conversations with sophisticated literary people, how she worried constantly that she would embarrass herself or say the wrong thing. But she also discovered something unexpected. People were genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. They wanted to talk about literature, about writing, about ideas. For the first time in her life, Charlotte was valued not for her ability to sew or manage a household or teach children, but for her mind. Still, she insisted on maintaining some privacy. She did not allow her name to be publicly announced as Currer Bell. In London literary circles, people knew, but the general public did not. She could walk down the street without being recognised. She could attend church on Sunday without being stared at. She had fame, but she could still control the boundaries around it. This changed in 1850. After Emily and Anne had both died, after Charlotte was left alone as the surviving sister, she decided to write a preface to a new edition of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey. In this preface she revealed the truth, that Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell had been Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, that they were sisters from Yorkshire, that Emily and Anne were now dead. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly everyone wanted to meet Charlotte Bronte. She received invitations to London, to stay with publishers and editors, to attend literary gatherings and dinner parties. The novelist William Makepeace Thackeray invited her to his home. She met Elizabeth Gaskell, who would later become her biographer. She was feted and celebrated and scrutinised, and Charlotte hated it. She found the attention exhausting and intrusive. She was painfully shy in person, awkward at parties, uncomfortable with compliments. She much preferred the solitude of Haworth, where she could write in peace. But she also felt obligated to accept these invitations, to represent her sister's legacy, to be gracious and sociable even when every instinct told her to retreat. In her letters from this period, Charlotte describes feeling like she's playing a part. The celebrated author attending London soirée is not the real Charlotte, she writes. The real Charlotte is the small, plain woman sitting at a table in a Yorkshire parsonage, writing by candlelight, living mostly in her imagination. Another double life, the private self and the public persona. The novelist the world wanted her to be, and the person she actually was. There is a famous anecdote about Charlotte meeting Thackeray. He had written the introduction to the second edition of Jane Eyre, praising it extravagantly. Charlotte admired his work enormously. When she finally met him at a dinner party, she was so nervous that she could barely speak. She sat silently through most of the meal, responding in monosyllables when people tried to engage her in conversation. Thackeray later commented that he had expected someone vibrant and passionate like Jane Eyre herself. Instead, he met this tiny, quiet woman who seemed almost frightened of the social situation. He could not reconcile the boldness of the writing with the timidity of the writer. But this is what Charlotte had been trying to tell people all along. The writing was where she could be bold. On the page she could be passionate, angry, rebellious, romantic. In real life she was constrained by Victorian propriety, by her own shyness, by the expectations placed on unmarried women. The novel was the space where her true self could emerge. Everything else was performance. Now, I want to talk about something that modern celebrities would find familiar. The way fame attracts not just admirers but also critics, scandals and invasions of privacy. For the Fox sisters, this meant constant accusations of fraud, committees examining their bodies, looking for hidden mechanisms or apparatus, journalists following them, trying to catch them in a mistake, former associates selling stories to newspapers about their private lives, every séance attended by people hoping to prove them fake. In Troy, New York in 1850, Kate Fox was actually the target of an attempted kidnapping. A group of men, apparently offended by the Fox sisters' performances and convinced they were dangerous frauds, tried to physically abduct Kate after a public demonstration. She escaped, but the incident left her shaken and afraid. Can you imagine being chased through the streets by angry men because of a performance you gave? For Charlotte, the scrutiny was more subtle but no less invasive. Critics dissected her novels looking for autobiographical details. They speculated about her personal life, her romantic experiences, her religious beliefs. After Shirley was published in 1849, people in Yorkshire recognised themselves in the characters and were sometimes offended by how they were portrayed. And then there were the reviews. Some were glowing, others were vicious. One critic wrote that if Currer Bell was a woman, she must be one who had forfeited the society of her own sex through some moral failing. The implication being that no decent woman could write about passion and desire the way Charlotte did. Charlotte tried not to read the negative reviews, but of course she did. Every artist does. And they wounded her deeply. She would write to her publisher asking why people felt the need to be so cruel, to attack not just her work but her character and morality. This is the dark side of fame that people rarely discuss. The way it opens you up to judgment from strangers who feel entitled to opinions about every aspect of your life. The way you lose control over your own story because everyone else is telling their version of it. And here is something else that both the Fox sisters and the Bronte sisters experienced. The isolation that comes with fame. You would think being celebrated would connect you to more people, create community and friendship. But often it does the opposite. Kate and Maggie could not have normal friendships because everyone wanted something from them. Either they wanted a free séance, or they wanted to expose the sisters as frauds, or they wanted to be associated with famous mediums. There was always an ulterior motive. Trust became impossible. Charlotte found that fame created a barrier between her and old friends. People who had known her before Jane Eyre now treated her differently, with a kind of deference or awkwardness. New acquaintances wanted to meet Charlotte Bronte, the famous author, not Charlotte the person. She wrote to friends about feeling more alone after success than she had before it, and none of them could escape. Kate and Maggie needed the income from their performances. Charlotte felt obligated to her publishers and readers to continue producing novels. Fame became a trap, golden perhaps, but a trap nonetheless. I think about this sometimes when I see modern celebrities struggling with addiction, with mental health crises, with the pressure of constant public scrutiny. We tend to think these are new problems, products of social media and 24-hour news cycles. But the Fox sisters were dealing with these same issues in the 1850s. Charlotte Bronte was navigating the tension between privacy and publicity in the 1840s. The technology changes, but the human cost of fame remains remarkably consistent. So our sisters were famous, celebrated, financially successful by the standards of their time, but they were also exhausted, controlled, scrutinized, and increasingly isolated. The double lives they were living, the public personas and the private realities, were taking a severe toll, and for some of them, the weight of maintaining the performance, of living up to expectations, of carrying secrets, would become unbearable. Let us turn our attention now to the breaking points, to the moments when the strain of the double life became too much, to the addictions and the despair, to the losses and the grief, to the very human ways these extraordinary women began to fall apart under pressure they were never equipped to handle. There are moments in every life when the weight of everything you've been carrying suddenly becomes too much, when the facade cracks, when the double life collapses in on itself. For our sisters, these breaking points came in different forms: illness, addiction, death, despair. But they all shared a common thread: the unbearable cost of living as someone you are not. The year 1848 was catastrophic for the Bronte family. September 24th. Branwell Bronte, the only son, the boy his father had placed all his hopes upon, died at the age of 31. He had been declining for years, destroyed by alcohol and laudanum, an opium-based painkiller that was freely available in Victorian England and catastrophically addictive. Branwell had been brilliant as a child, imaginative, talented at painting and writing, full of grand ambitions. But every opportunity he was given, art school, tutoring positions, employment as a railway clerk, he squandered through drink and recklessness. His affair with Lydia Robinson, the married woman who employed him as a tutor to her son, ended when her husband discovered it. Branwell was dismissed, Lydia rejected him, and he spiralled completely. He returned to the parsonage at Haworth and spent his final years drinking himself to death, while his sisters watched helplessly. They loved him. They remembered the creative, energetic boy he had been, but they also resented him, resented that he had opportunities they could never have, a university education, the freedom to pursue art or writing without hiding behind pseudonyms, the ability to walk into a pub or travel alone without scandal, and he had wasted all of it. Charlotte wrote to a friend describing Branwell's final months. She said, and I am paraphrasing, that he was beyond their help, that addiction had consumed him so completely that the brother they loved was already gone long before his body stopped breathing. She describes the pain of watching someone destroy themselves, the frustration of being unable to save them, the guilt of feeling relief when it was finally over. At Branwell's funeral, Emily caught a cold. This was not unusual. Yorkshire in autumn is damp and raw, and Emily had always been somewhat frail despite her fierce spirit. But this cold did not get better. It settled into her lungs and became something worse. Consumption, tuberculosis, the disease that killed more Victorians than any other. Emily refused all medical treatment, refused to acknowledge she was seriously ill. She continued her daily routine, baking bread, walking the moors with her dogs, caring for her father, growing thinner and weaker but absolutely refusing to admit defeat. Charlotte and Anne watched her decline with growing horror and helplessness. On December 19th, 1848, Emily finally collapsed. She'd been insisting she was fine up until that morning. But around noon she could no longer stand. Charlotte and Anne helped her to the sofa in the parlour, and there, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Emily Bronte died. She was 30 years old. Charlotte wrote that Emily died without ever saying she was afraid, without asking for comfort, without allowing anyone to truly care for her in her final hours. It was so characteristic of Emily, that fierce, solitary independence carried all the way to the grave. But think about what this means. Think about living your entire life holding everyone at arm's length, refusing vulnerability, keeping your true self so protected that even your own sisters could not reach you. Emily wrote Wuthering Heights, a novel of overwhelming passion and intensity. But in life, she would not let herself be known. Not fully, not even by the people who loved her most. Was this a form of self-protection? A survival mechanism for living in a world that did not value women's inner lives? Or was it simply Emily's nature, her particular way of being in the world? We will never know. What we do know is that she died alone in the most fundamental sense, surrounded by family but unreachable, locked inside herself until the end. Anne was devastated. Emily had been her closest companion, her partner in creating the imaginary world of Gondal, her sister in every sense. And now Charlotte and Anne were the only ones left in that silent parsonage. Anne tried to keep going. She had just published The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, her extraordinary radical novel about domestic abuse and alcoholism. She wanted to write more. But by January 1849, just a month after Emily's death, Anne began showing symptoms of consumption as well. The same cough, the same wasting away. Unlike Emily, Anne accepted medical treatment. She consulted doctors. She tried the remedies they prescribed, but nothing helped. By May, it was clear she was dying. Charlotte took her to Scarborough on the coast, hoping the sea air might help. It was Anne's wish to die by the sea, rather than in the gloomy parsonage that had claimed so many of her siblings. Anne died on May 28, 1849, at a boarding house in Scarborough. She was 29 years old. Charlotte was with her, and then Charlotte had to travel back to Haworth alone, to a house that had once held 6 siblings, and now held only herself and her aging father. Can you imagine that grief? 3 siblings dead in the span of 9 months. Branwell, Emily, Anne, all gone. The parsonage echoing with absence. The creative partnership, the shared jokes and references, the entire childhood world they had built together. Erased. Charlotte wrote to her publisher W.S. Williams in June 1849, describing her desolation. She said that the house felt like a tomb, that she wandered from room to room unable to settle, that she would catch herself expecting to hear Emily's footsteps or Anne's voice, and then remembering, with fresh pain each time, that they were gone. This is trauma. This is what happens when loss comes too quickly, too completely, for the mind to process it. Charlotte was not just grieving, she was shattered, and yet she kept writing. She finished her novel, Shirley, though she later said she could barely remember writing parts of it, that she was moving through the world in a fog of grief. Writing was her survival mechanism, the thing that kept her tethered to the world when everything else was falling apart. But the isolation was crushing. Charlotte had always been the most socially ambitious of the sisters, the one most interested in the wider world. But she'd also defined herself in relation to her siblings. She was Charlotte, the oldest sister, Charlotte who wrote with Emily and Anne. Who was she now, alone? She threw herself into correspondence, long letters to friends and fellow writers. She visited London more frequently, staying with her publisher's family, attending literary gatherings. But she wrote that these social activities felt hollow, that she was performing the role of Charlotte Brontë, the successful author, while inside she was just empty. Depression in the Victorian era was not understood as a medical condition. It was seen as a moral failing, a lack of willpower or faith in God. People suffering from what we would now recognize as clinical depression were told to pray more, to think positive thoughts, to simply will themselves out of it. There were no antidepressants, no therapy, no real understanding of brain chemistry or trauma. So Charlotte suffered alone. She described in letters this feeling of being disconnected from life, of going through motions without feeling anything real. She talked about nights when she could not sleep, when the memories of her dead siblings crowded in, and she felt she was going mad with grief. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Kate Fox was battling her own demons. The alcoholism that had started as a way to calm her nerves before performances had become a full-blown addiction by the 1870s. After her husband Jenkin died in 1881, it got worse. Alcohol was Kate's escape from the double life she'd been living for over 30 years. When she was drunk, she did not have to think about the performances, the lies, the people who believed in her, the weight of maintaining the fraud. She could just not feel anything for a while. But addiction destroys everything it touches. Kate's reputation within the spiritualist community, which had once been impeccable, began to suffer. People whispered that she was unreliable, that her drinking made her an embarrassment. Leah, always concerned with maintaining respectability, was horrified. She saw Kate's alcoholism not as a cry for help, but as a threat to the family business. And then Leah made her move. She began working to have Kate declared an unfit mother, to have Kate's 2 young sons taken away from her. The justification was Kate's drinking. The reality was control. Leah had controlled her sisters' lives since they were children, and she was not about to let that control slip now. This was the final cruelty. Kate had endured the performances, the scrutiny, the constant pressure. She had lived the lie for decades, and now her sister was going to take her children. It was this threat that pushed Kate and Maggie toward the confession of 1888. It was revenge, yes, but it was also a desperate attempt to wrest back some control over their own lives. Think about the psychology of addiction in the context of the double life. When your entire existence is a performance, when you cannot be yourself even in private because the lie has become so all-consuming, substances offer a temporary escape. They quiet the voice in your head that knows you're living a fraud. They dull the anxiety of constant vigilance. They create a space where you can just exist without performing. Kate was not weak. She was breaking under a burden that would have destroyed most people much sooner. The tragedy is that Victorian society had no compassion for addiction, no understanding of it as a disease rather than a moral failure. So Kate was judged and condemned and ultimately abandoned by many of the people who had once celebrated her. Maggie struggled with alcohol as well, though perhaps not as severely as Kate. But she had her own breaking points, the poverty she lived in after Cain's death, the humiliation of his family denying their marriage and refusing her any inheritance, the necessity of returning to spiritualism, the very thing Cain had begged her to leave, just to survive financially. There is a photograph of Maggie from the 1880s shortly before the confession. She looks haunted. Her face is gaunt, her eyes weary. She's wearing black as she always did after Cain's death. But it is more than mourning clothes. There is something defeated in her posture, something that suggests a person who has fought for too long and is too tired to keep fighting. Both Kate and Maggie died in poverty. Kate in 1892, Maggie in 1893. They died estranged from much of the spiritualist community that had made them famous. They died with their reputations in tatters, some calling them frauds, others calling them victims, no one quite knowing what to believe. Their funerals were small, attended by few people. The media that had once celebrated them largely ignored their deaths. They slipped away quietly, these women who had once captivated the world, who had launched a religious movement that claimed millions of followers. And here is perhaps the saddest part. In 1904, more than a decade after the Fox sisters died, human bones were found in the walls of the house in Hydesville where the rappings first began. The discovery briefly reignited interest in the Fox sisters. Some spiritualists claimed this proved the original story was true, that there really had been a murdered peddler, that the spirits had been real all along. But analysis of the bones was inconclusive. They might have been human, They might have been animal bones. They might have been placed there later as a hoax or a publicity stunt. The truth remained elusive, just as it always had been. What do these breaking points teach us? What can we learn from the ways our sisters fell apart under pressure? I think they show us that you cannot live a divided life indefinitely without paying a price. That secrets and lies and performances take a psychological toll that eventually becomes unbearable. That addiction is often a symptom of deeper pain, a desperate attempt to cope with circumstances that feel unendurable. That grief, when it is not properly processed, when there is no space or language or permission to truly feel it, can poison everything. They also show us that Victorian society, for all its emphasis on propriety and morality, was often profoundly cruel to the vulnerable. There was no safety net for Kate Fox when her addiction spiraled, no mental health support for Charlotte when she was drowning in grief, no way for Emily to be her authentic self in a world that demanded women be soft and yielding, and she was neither. These women needed help. They needed compassion. They needed permission to be human, to struggle, to not be perfect. But the double standards of their era, the impossible expectations placed on women, the lack of understanding about mental health and addiction, all of these combined to trap them in cycles of suffering they could not escape. And yet, even in their darkest moments, they left us something valuable. Charlotte kept writing through her grief. Kate and Maggie, in their confession, told a truth that had been buried for 40 years. They may have been broken, but they were not defeated. Not entirely, not in the ways that mattered most. So let us examine now what happened after the breaking. How did the survivors rebuild? What did confession and revelation actually accomplish? And how did the relationships between sisters, complicated, controlling, loving, toxic, shape the final chapters of these extraordinary lives? The story is not over yet. Sisters can be many things: protectors and rivals, confidants and strangers, the people who know you best and the ones who can wound you most deeply. In the stories we've been following, the bonds between sisters were complicated by power, by control, by secrets that could never be fully spoken, and sometimes the person who saves you is also the person who traps you. Sometimes love and exploitation wear the same face. Leah Fox was 34 years old when her younger sisters first produced those mysterious rapping sounds in 1848. She was a music teacher, divorced, struggling financially, raising a daughter alone in a society that offered divorced women very few options and even less respect. When the phenomena began, when neighbours started talking about spirits communicating through Kate and Maggie, Leah saw something that changed everything. She saw a way out of poverty, a way to matter, a way to build something extraordinary from nothing. Was she wrong to do this? Was she exploiting her younger sisters, or was she protecting them? The answer, I think, is both. And that is what makes the relationship so complicated. Leah brought the girls to Rochester. She organised the first public demonstrations. She negotiated with venues and managed the finances. She was the business mind, the organiser, the public face of the operation when needed. Without Leah, Kate and Maggie would have remained curiosities in a small town, their moment of fame flickering out within weeks. With Leah, they became a phenomenon that lasted 40 years and changed the religious landscape of 2 continents. But Leah also controlled everything: where they performed, how much they were paid, where they lived, what they could say publicly. She took the largest share of the profits, justifying this as payment for her managerial work. She made decisions without consulting her younger sisters, treating them as assets to be managed rather than autonomous individuals with their own desires and dreams. There is a letter from Maggie to Alicia Kent Kane from the 1850s where she describes feeling trapped. She writes that Leah monitors her correspondence, controls who she can see, dictates her schedule down to the hour. She says, and I am paraphrasing, that she loves her sister but also fears her, that Leah's will is so strong and her own so weak that she cannot imagine how to escape. This is not the language of healthy sisterhood. This is the language of control. And yet, Leah probably believed she was acting in her sister's best interests. In her mind, she was protecting them from exploitation by others, managing their careers competently, ensuring they had income and security. She saw herself as the responsible one, the adult in the room, the person making the hard decisions that her younger, more impulsive sisters could not be trusted to make. From Leah's perspective, when Kate started drinking heavily and damaging her reputation, it was a betrayal of everything Leah had built. When Maggie wanted to confess the fraud to please Alicia Kent Kane, it was selfish recklessness that would destroy their livelihood. Leah was preserving spiritualism, preserving their income, preserving what she saw as their legacy. But from Kate and Maggie's perspective, Leah was the person who had stolen their childhoods, forced them into a lifetime of deception, and was now threatening to take Kate's children. Leah was the oppressor they finally had the chance to strike back against. The 1888 confession was, in many ways, less about spiritualism and more about this toxic sister dynamic finally exploding. It was Kate and Maggie saying, "You have controlled us for 40 years, but you cannot control this. We're telling the truth and there is nothing you can do to stop us." Leah responded with fury. She publicly denounced the confession as lies, fabricated by enemies of spiritualism. She claimed her sisters had been bribed and manipulated. She never acknowledged any responsibility for their suffering or admitted to controlling them. And when she died in 1890, she died still defending spiritualism, still maintaining the narrative that her sisters had been genuine mediums and she had been their devoted protector. Do you have siblings? If you do, you probably understand how complex these relationships can be. The mixture of love and resentment, the way childhood roles can calcify into patterns that last a lifetime, the difficulty of seeing each other clearly, separate from the stories you've been telling yourselves since you were children. Now let us turn to the Bronte sisters, because their dynamic was completely different and yet equally shaped by unequal power. Charlotte was the oldest surviving sister after Maria and Elizabeth died. She was also the most ambitious, the most interested in the wider world beyond Holworth. From early on, she seems to have appointed herself as the leader, the decision-maker, the one who would manage their literary careers. It was Charlotte who discovered Emily's poems and pushed for publication. It was Charlotte who negotiated with publishers. It was Charlotte who made the decision to reveal their identities after Emily and Anne had died. And it was Charlotte who, in 1850, wrote the preface to the new edition of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey that would shape how readers understood Emily and Anne for generations. This preface is a complicated document. On one level, Charlotte is defending her sisters against critics who found their novels shocking and immoral. She's explaining that they wrote from genuine feeling, from observation of real life, not from any desire to scandalize or corrupt. She's protecting their reputations, but on another level, Charlotte is fundamentally misrepresenting who Emily and Anne were. She describes Emily as simple, childlike, someone who did not truly understand the darkness she was writing about in Wuthering Heights. She claims Emily had little knowledge of the world, that she wrote about passionate, violent characters without comprehending what such people were really like. This is absurd. Emily Bronte created Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw, two of the most psychologically complex and morally ambiguous characters in English literature. She understood exactly what she was doing. The violence, the obsession, the destructiveness of their love. This was intentional, carefully crafted, the work of a sophisticated artist making deliberate choices. But Charlotte could not accept this. She needed to believe that her sister was innocent, protected from the ugliness of the world by the isolation of Haworth. So she created this narrative of Emily as an unknowing genius, someone who channeled dark truths without understanding them. She did something similar with Anne, writing that Anne lacked the power and originality of Emily, that her work was worthy but lesser. This was devastating to Anne's reputation. For decades, critics dismissed Anne as the least talented Bronte sister, the one who tried but never quite measured up to Charlotte and Emily. It was not until the mid-20th century that scholars began to seriously re-evaluate Anne's work and realized that Charlotte had been profoundly wrong. Anne was not weak or unoriginal. She was the most radical of the three sisters, the one willing to write about domestic abuse, alcoholism, women's rights to leave marriages and control their own lives. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is an astonishingly feminist novel for 1848, far ahead of its time. But Charlotte's preface buried this understanding for 100 years. Why did she do this? I do not think it was malicious. I think Charlotte was grieving, trying to make sense of losing both her sisters within months. I think she needed to believe she understood them, that she could explain them to the world, and I think, on some level, she could not accept that her younger sisters might have been her equals or even her superiors as artists. This is a different kind of control than Leah's over Kate and Maggie. It is more subtle, perhaps unconscious, but it is still an attempt to shape the narrative, to define who her sisters were allowed to be in the public imagination. Emily and Anne were not alive to defend themselves, to correct the record, to say, "No, actually, this is not who I was or what I meant." Charlotte became the sole voice, the interpreter, the gatekeeper, and she used that power, intentionally or not, to diminish them. There is something deeply sad about this. Charlotte loved her sisters. She grieved them genuinely and profoundly. But love does not always mean understanding, and grief does not necessarily grant clarity. Sometimes we reduce the people we love to versions we can comprehend, versions that fit our own needs and narratives. Here is another layer to consider. Charlotte outlived all her siblings. She was the survivor, the one left behind. And survivors often feel a complicated mixture of guilt and responsibility. Guilt that they lived while others died. Responsibility to carry on the legacy, to make meaning from the loss. Charlotte threw herself into this role. She finished Shirley, which she'd been working on when Emily and Anne died. She wrote Villette, her final and perhaps most psychologically complex novel, which draws heavily on her time in Brussels and her impossible love for Constantine Heger. She managed the publication of her sister's works. She became the public face of the Bronte family, but she also struggled terribly with loneliness. The parsonage felt empty without her siblings. Her father was going blind and becoming more difficult. Charlotte was in her 30s, unmarried, living in a small village where she had very little in common with her neighbours. She made trips to London, developed friendships with other writers like Elizabeth Gaskell, but always returned to Haworth, to her duty as her father's companion. In 1854, Arthur Bell Nichols, her father's curate, proposed marriage. He'd been devoted to Charlotte for years, patient and steadfast. Patrick Bronte initially opposed the marriage violently, furious that his assistant would presume to court his famous daughter, but eventually he relented. Charlotte married Nichols in June 1854. She was 38 years old. Her letters suggest the marriage brought her some happiness, or at least contentment. Nichols was kind, stable, genuinely loving, but he was not an intellectual equal. He did not understand her writing the way Higa had. He was uncomfortable with her fame, and then, 9 months later, Charlotte was dead. The cause is listed as tuberculosis, but she was also pregnant and suffering from severe nausea and dehydration. Some historians believe she died of hyperemesis gravidarum, a pregnancy complication that can be fatal if untreated. She died on March 31, 1855, at the age of 38. Nichols was devastated. He also became the controller of Charlotte's legacy. He burned many of her letters, particularly those that revealed her feelings for Higa. He was selective about what he allowed to be published. He wanted to protect Charlotte's reputation, but in doing so he erased parts of who she really was. Do you see the pattern? The sisters who lived double lives in their own lifetimes continued to have their identities shaped and controlled by others, even after death. Leah controlling the narrative about Kate and Maggie, Charlotte shaping the understanding of Emily and Anne, Nichols protecting and editing Charlotte's memory. These women fought so hard to be seen and known on their own terms. But in the end, other people still got to decide what parts of their stories would be told and what parts would be hidden. There is a particular tragedy in this for Emily. She was the most private of all the sisters, the most determined to keep her inner life hidden. She published under a pseudonym and never publicly acknowledged her authorship. She guarded her poems and her thoughts fiercely. And then Charlotte wrote that preface, exposing Emily to the world while simultaneously misrepresenting who she was. Emily would have hated it, the exposure and the misunderstanding both. And Anne, the youngest, the one who survived longer than Emily but not long enough to see the full impact of her work. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was controversial when it was published. Many found it shocking, even immoral, that a woman would write about alcoholism and abuse so frankly. Anne's publisher refused to do a second edition. Charlotte herself was ambivalent about it, finding it too dark. But Anne knew exactly what she was doing. She wrote in the preface to the second edition of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall that she believed it was right to show the truth about vice and its consequences. She said, and I am paraphrasing, that if there is abuse and alcoholism in the world, it does more good to show it honestly than to pretend it does not exist. This was a radical position in 1848. Anne wanted to help people, particularly women trapped in bad marriages, by showing them their experiences reflected in literature. By giving voice to things that were usually hidden, she was using her art for social good, for justice. But Charlotte's lukewarm response to the novel and Anne's early death meant this understanding was lost for a long time. Anne was remembered, if at all, as the minor sister, the one who tried but never achieved what Charlotte and Emily did. It is only in recent decades that Anne has been properly recognized as a pioneering feminist writer, someone who used fiction to challenge the most oppressive aspects of Victorian marriage and gender roles, someone who was brave enough to tell uncomfortable truths. So what do we learn from these complicated sister relationships? We learn that family is not always a source of support and understanding. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who control you most completely. We learn that love and exploitation can coexist, that someone can genuinely care for you while also using you for their own purposes. We learn that even after death, the struggle for authentic representation continues, that those who survive get to shape the story, and their version may not be the truth. But we also learn about resilience, about the ways people resist control even when the odds are against them. Kate and Maggie's confession, however complicated its aftermath, was an act of rebellion against Lear's authority. Anne's writing, despite Charlotte's dismissal, survived and eventually found readers who understood its value. The double lives our sisters lived were often imposed by circumstances, by other people, by the structures of their society. But within those constraints, they found ways to be themselves, on the page, in secret letters, in moments of rebellion. They may have been controlled, but they were not defeated, and that matters. Let us turn now to consider the legacies these women left behind, because the story does not end with their deaths. Their work, their lives, their struggles continue to resonate and influence us today in ways that would have astonished them. Legacy is a strange thing. Sometimes the people who seem most powerful in their own time fade into obscurity, while those who struggled in poverty and obscurity during their lives become immortal. The Victorian sisters we've been following left behind legacies that none of them could have predicted, impacts that continue to ripple through our world more than a century and a half after their deaths. Walk into any bookstore today, anywhere in the world, and you will find the works of Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte on the shelves. Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. These novels have never been out of print. They have been translated into dozens of languages, adapted into countless films and television series, analysed in thousands of academic papers, read by millions of people across generations. The Bronte sisters are not just famous, they are foundational. They are part of the bedrock of English literature, studied in schools from London to Tokyo to São Paulo. Their influence on subsequent writers is incalculable. Every novel about a governess who rises above her station, every story of passionate, complicated love, every exploration of women's inner lives and struggles, these owe a debt to the Brontes. But here is what strikes me as remarkable. The Brontes achieved this immortality despite dying young, despite being poor, despite being women in an era that did not value women's intellectual contributions, despite publishing under male pseudonyms, despite living in isolation in a small Yorkshire village far from the centres of literary culture. They succeeded not because the system supported them, but in spite of the fact that it opposed them at every turn, and that makes their achievement all the more extraordinary. Think about Jane Eyre for a moment. When it was published in 1847, it was revolutionary. Here was a novel with a plain, poor, powerless heroine who refused to accept her assigned place in the world, who demanded to be treated as a human being with dignity and rights, who said no to the man she loved when accepting him would mean compromising her principles. The famous line from the novel where Jane says to Rochester, "Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart." This was radical in 1847. This was a direct challenge to the social hierarchy, to the idea that some people mattered more than others based on wealth, or birth, or appearance. And Charlotte was writing from experience. She had been a governess. She knew what it was like to be treated as inferior, to be ignored or dismissed because of her class and gender. She poured that rage and pain into Jane Eyre, and it resonated with readers because it spoke a truth they recognised. Jane Eyre became one of the most important feminist novels ever written, not because Charlotte set out to write a political tract, but because she told the truth about one woman's experience and in doing so, illuminated something universal about the human need for dignity and equality. Emily's Wuthering Heights had a different kind of impact. It baffled and horrified many of its initial readers. The characters were too dark, too violent, too morally ambiguous. Heathcliff was not a romantic hero by any conventional definition. He was cruel, obsessive, vengeful. His love for Catherine was destructive rather than redemptive. But over time, readers began to understand what Emily was doing. She was writing about passion without romanticizing it. She was showing that love could be a destructive force, that obsession could masquerade as devotion, that the human heart contained darkness as well as light. She was refusing to provide easy answers or moral clarity. Wuthering Heights is now considered one of the greatest novels in the English language precisely because it is so uncompromising, so willing to explore uncomfortable truths about human nature. It influenced generations of writers who wanted to write about the darker aspects of love and desire without sanitizing them. And Anne? Anne's legacy took longer to be recognized, but it is no less significant. The tenant of Wildfell Hall was suppressed for decades. Even Charlotte was uncomfortable with it, finding it too dark, too focused on the ugly realities of alcoholism and abuse. After Anne's death, Charlotte prevented it from being reprinted, effectively burying it. But the novel survived, and when it was rediscovered in the 20th century, scholars realized it was astonishingly ahead of its time. Anne was writing about domestic violence in 1848. She was depicting a woman who leaves an abusive marriage, takes her child, and builds an independent life through her own work as an artist. She was arguing that women had the right to leave bad marriages, to protect themselves and their children, to choose their own paths. This was not just feminist, this was radically feminist. And Anne did it quietly, without fanfare, simply by telling a story she believed needed to be told. Today, Anne is recognized as a pioneer of feminist literature, someone who used fiction to advocate for women's rights and autonomy. Scholars point to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall as one of the first feminist novels, alongside Jane Eyre. Anne's legacy is finally being properly honoured, even though it took more than a century for the world to catch up to her vision. Now what about the Fox sisters? Their legacy is more complicated, more contested, but no less significant. Spiritualism, the movement they inadvertently started, did not die when Maggie confessed in 1888. In fact, it barely slowed down. By 1897, less than 10 years after the confession, spiritualism claimed over 8 million followers in the United States alone. The movement had spread to England, to Europe, to Australia. Seances remained popular. Mediums continued to give readings. People still desperately wanted to believe in communication with the dead. Why did the movement survive the Fox sisters' confession? Because by 1888, spiritualism was bigger than them. It had developed its own theology, its own communities, its own institutions. Thousands of people had built their identities and livelihoods around it. Millions had found comfort in the belief that death was not the end. The confession could be dismissed as a lie, a moment of weakness, a betrayal orchestrated by enemies of the movement. And that is exactly what happened. Many spiritualists simply refused to believe the confession. Others developed elaborate rationalizations. The movement continued. Lily Dale, the spiritualist community in upstate New York, still exists today. Founded in 1879, it continues to operate as a place where mediums give readings, where people come seeking contact with deceased loved ones. The summer season brings thousands of visitors. Workshops on mediumship are offered. The tradition the Fox sisters started, however accidentally, is still alive. But the Fox sisters' legacy extends beyond spiritualism itself. They demonstrated something important about human psychology, about the power of belief, about how people will cling to comforting ideas even in the face of contradictory evidence. Modern psychics and mediums still use many of the same techniques the Fox sisters pioneered. Cold reading, generalized statements that seem specific, fishing for information and reflecting it back as messages from spirits. The methods have been updated for the modern era, but the fundamental approach remains the same, and people still believe, still seek out psychics and mediums, still want to think that death is not a final separation from those we love. The need the Fox sisters tapped into in 1848 has not disappeared. It is a fundamental human longing that transcends culture and time. There is also a darker legacy. The Fox sisters showed how easily children can be exploited, how fame can trap and destroy young people who are thrust into the spotlight without protection. Their story is a cautionary tale about child performers, about control and manipulation within families, about the price of living a lie. When we see child stars today struggling with addiction, with mental health crises, with the aftermath of being commodified and exhibited, we are seeing echoes of Kate and Maggie Fox's experience. The technology has changed, the mechanisms of fame have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain disturbingly similar. So both the Brontes and the Fox sisters left us with questions that are still relevant, about authenticity and performance, about the cost of fame, about women's autonomy and the barriers they face, about the power of belief and the human need for comfort in the face of death. But there is another aspect of their legacy that we should consider. These women lived double lives not by choice, but by necessity. The Brontes hid behind male pseudonyms because women writers were not taken seriously. The Fox sisters maintained a fraud because they were children when it started and then became trapped in it by economic need and family pressure. What would their lives have been like if they had lived in a more just society? If Charlotte, Emily and Anne could have published under their own names from the beginning, confident that their work would be judged on its merits rather than dismissed because of their gender. If Kate and Maggie had been allowed to be children, to grow up without the pressure of performance and deception, we cannot know, but we can recognize that their struggles, their double lives, were imposed on them by the limitations and injustices of their era. And we can honor their memory by working to create a world where people do not have to hide who they are to be heard, where women's voices are valued, where children are protected rather than exploited. The Bronte Parsonage Museum in Haworth receives thousands of visitors every year. People come from around the world to see where the sisters lived and wrote, to walk the moors they loved, to connect with their stories. The house has been preserved as it was in the 1850s. You can see the dining room table where Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre. You can see Emily's small bedroom. You can feel the presence of these extraordinary women in the very rooms where they lived their double lives. And in Hydesville, New York, there is a small memorial park on the site where the Fox cottage once stood. It is maintained by people who still believe in spiritualism, who see the Fox sisters as pioneers who opened the door to spirit communication. The marker reads, "On this site, events of March 31st, 1848 began Sisters Maggie and Kate Fox's central role in the origin of modern spiritualism." Two very different legacies, two very different ways of being remembered, but both speak to the enduring impact of these Victorian sisters who lived double lives. Their stories matter not just as historical curiosities, but as mirrors that reflect our own struggles. How many of us present one face to the world while hiding our true selves? How many of us feel trapped by expectations, by roles we did not choose, by the need to perform rather than simply be? How many of us long to be seen and known authentically, but fear the cost of revelation? These are timeless questions, and the Victorian sisters we've been following wrestled with them in ways that still resonate today. Their lives were tragedies in many ways, but they were also triumphs. They created work that mattered. They told truths that needed telling. They resisted even when resistance seemed impossible, and perhaps most importantly, they survived in memory. Their names, their stories, their struggles continue to be told. They are not forgotten, they matter. But understanding their legacies is only part of the story. We need to step back now and look at the bigger picture, to see how their individual experiences illuminate broader truths about Victorian society, about gender and power, about the human condition itself. So let us examine what these double lives reveal about the world they lived in, and, perhaps surprisingly, about the world we live in now. If you could travel back to Victorian England and ask people what their society stood for, they would tell you about progress and morality, about the triumph of civilization over barbarism, about duty and propriety and the steady march toward enlightenment. They would show you the railways and the telegraphs, the grand exhibitions and the industrial innovations. They would speak with pride about the British Empire and its mission to civilize the world. But if you looked more closely beneath that polished surface, you would see the double life of an entire culture, a society that preached sexual purity while prostitution was rampant in every major city, that spoke of family values while workhouses tore children from their mothers, that claimed moral superiority while exploiting millions of colonized people, that idealized women as angels while denying them basic legal rights and economic independence. The Victorian era was in many ways built on hypocrisy, on the gap between what was said and what was done, between the public performance of virtue and the private reality of vice and suffering. Our sisters lived their double lives within this broader context of cultural duplicity. They were not aberrations. They were symptoms of a society that demanded impossible standards and then punished people for being unable to meet them. Consider the position of women in Victorian society. On the surface they were revered, placed on pedestals, called the fairer sex, the moral guardians of civilization. The home was supposed to be their domain, the place where their nurturing spiritual nature could flourish. But scratch that surface, and you find a different reality. Married women had no legal identity separate from their husbands. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman's property, earnings, even her children belonged to her husband. She could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued, could not keep her own wages. She was legally non-existent. If a woman did not marry, her options were severely limited. She could live as a dependent in her family's home, a burden tolerated but not valued. She could become a governess or teacher, working for poverty wages in positions that offered no security and little respect. Or she could work in factories or as a domestic servant, facing exploitation and dangerous conditions. Divorce was nearly impossible for women to obtain and carried such social stigma that it meant complete ruin. A divorced woman was shut out of respectable society, cut off from her children, economically vulnerable. This was the world Anne Bronte was writing about in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. When her protagonist Helen Graham leaves her abusive alcoholic husband, she is doing something that was not just unconventional, but virtually unthinkable in 1848. She takes her son, assumes a false identity, and supports herself through her art. She chooses autonomy over respectability. Anne knew this was radical. She knew many readers would be scandalized. But she also knew that there were women trapped in terrible marriages with no legal recourse, no way out. And she wanted to show them a different possibility, even if it was just in fiction. The double standard around sexuality was particularly stark. A man could visit prostitutes, keep mistresses, father illegitimate children, and as long as he was discreet, his respectability remained intact. But a woman who engaged in any sexual activity outside of marriage was ruined. Forever. One mistake, one moment of passion or poor judgment, and she became an outcast. The Victorians were obsessed with female virginity and chastity, but this obsession existed alongside a thriving sex trade. Thousands of prostitutes worked in London alone. Some historians estimate that 1 in 16 women in Victorian London engaged in prostitution at some point in their lives, driven to it by poverty and lack of alternatives. These women were simultaneously invisible and everywhere. Respectable society pretended they did not exist, but men of all classes used their services. The hypocrisy was staggering. Charles Dickens wrote about this extensively. He worked with a home for fallen women, trying to help prostitutes leave the trade and build new lives. He understood that these women were victims of economic injustice, not moral failures. But this was a minority view. Most Victorians preferred to condemn rather than understand. This is the context in which our sisters were operating. A society that demanded women be pure and passive but offered them no real protection or support. That idealized them while denying them rights. That placed them on pedestals and then punished them for being human. The Bronte sisters and the Fox sisters both found ways to navigate this impossible terrain, but they paid a price for it. The Brontes had to hide behind male names to be taken seriously as writers. The Fox sisters had to perform a role, to be seen as conduits for spirits rather than agents in their own right, to be acceptable. And this brings us to something important about double lives in general. Sometimes they are not about deception in the malicious sense. Sometimes they are about survival, about finding ways to exist in a world that does not want to make space for you as you truly are. When Charlotte Bronte became Currer Bell, she was not trying to trick anyone. She was trying to get her work published and read on its merits. When the Fox sisters maintained their performance as mediums, they were trapped in a situation that had started as a childhood prank and become their only means of financial survival. The double life in these cases was an adaptation to an unjust system, a way of working around barriers that should never have existed in the first place. Now let us talk about something that might surprise you. The ways in which our modern world still demands double lives from many people. The ways in which the Victorian dynamics we've been exploring are not as distant as we might like to think. How many people today present one version of themselves at work and a completely different version at home? How many suppress parts of their identity to fit into professional environments or family expectations? How many feel they cannot be fully honest about who they are without risking rejection or consequences? Think about LGBTQ individuals who are not out in all areas of their lives, who are themselves with friends but closeted at work or with family. This is a double life imposed by a society that still, in many places, does not fully accept gender and sexual diversity. Think about people of colour who engage in code switching, altering their speech patterns and behaviour depending on whether they are in predominantly white spaces or in their own communities. This is a survival strategy in a world where being authentically yourself can trigger discrimination or worse. Think about women in male-dominated professions who feel they have to downplay their femininity, adopt masculine communication styles, hide pregnancies or family responsibilities to be taken seriously. This is the legacy of the Victorian double standard, still operating in new forms. The technology has changed. The specific dynamics have evolved, but the fundamental pressure to perform a version of yourself that is acceptable to those with power, that remains. And social media has created new layers of double lives. The curated Instagram feed that shows only the highlights, the professional LinkedIn persona, the anonymous Twitter account where you can say what you really think. We are all living multiple versions of ourselves online and offline, public and private. The Victorian sisters would understand this completely. They knew what it was like to maintain different versions of themselves for different audiences. They knew the exhaustion of constant performance, the loneliness of not being fully known, the fear of exposure. But here is what they also knew, that within the constraints, within the performance, there are ways to tell the truth. Charlotte Brontë might have hidden behind a male pseudonym, but she told profoundly true stories about women's experiences in her novels. The Fox sisters might have been performing a fraud, but they were also responding to a genuine human need for comfort in the face of death. Sometimes the performance contains truth. Sometimes the double life is the only way truth can be spoken. And sometimes the act of maintaining the double life becomes unbearable, and confession becomes necessary. Not just for others to know the truth, but for the person living the lie to reclaim some sense of authenticity. This is what happened when Maggie Fox confessed in 1888. Yes, she was paid. Yes, she wanted to hurt Leah. But I think she also needed, after 40 years, to say out loud, "This was not real. I have been living a lie, and I cannot carry it anymore." The confession did not set her free, not really. She recanted a year later, died in poverty and obscurity, never found peace. But for one moment on that stage in New York she told the truth, and perhaps that mattered, even if it changed nothing. The Brontë sisters never got to make a public confession in the same way, but they told their truths in their novels. They poured their real feelings, their genuine observations, their authentic selves into their fiction. The novels were their confession, their way of saying, "This is what it is really like to be a woman in this world. This is what I have seen and felt and understood." So what do we learn from all of this? What do the double lives of Victorian sisters teach us about being human in any era? We learn that systems of oppression force people into performances and deceptions, that when you deny people the right to be themselves, they will find ways to exist anyway, even if those ways involve hiding and pretending. We learn that double lives exact a terrible cost, psychological, emotional, sometimes physical. That living divided is a form of suffering. We learn that confession and revelation are complicated, that telling the truth does not always lead to freedom or redemption, that sometimes the world is not ready to hear what you have to say. But we also learn about resilience, about the ways people survive impossible circumstances, about how creativity and art can be outlets for truths that cannot be spoken directly, about how legacy can transcend the limitations of a single life. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago, but its influence lingers. The double standards, the hypocrisies, the barriers based on gender and class, these have evolved but not disappeared. And as long as people are forced to hide parts of themselves to survive, the stories of our Victorian sisters will remain relevant. So let us bring this long night's journey to a close. Let us reflect on what these stories mean and what we carry forward from them. We have travelled a long road together tonight, from the windswept moors of Yorkshire to the gaslit theatres of New York, from childhood pranks to international fame, from secret loves to public confessions, from the heights of literary immortality to deaths in poverty and obscurity. And now, as our journey comes to an end, I want to leave you with a question. What does it mean to live authentically in a world that demands performance? The Victorian sisters we have spent this night with, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, Kate, and Maggie, they never fully solved this riddle. How could they? They were trapped in a time and place that offered women impossibly narrow paths. Be the angel in the house, pure and passive and ornamental, or be ruined, cast out, condemned. There was no middle ground, no space for complexity, for ambition, for the full range of human feeling and desire. So they found workarounds. They created double lives. They hid behind pseudonyms and performances. They told their truth slant through fiction and seances, through channels that gave them just enough cover to exist while still being heard, and it worked in its way. The Bronte sisters became immortal. Their novels are read and loved and studied 175 years after they were written. Jane Eyre has never been out of print. Never. Think about that. A novel written by a poor woman in a small village in 1847 has been continuously available to readers every single year since then. That is not just success. That is transcendence. Emily's Wuthering Heights confused its first readers, but it has become one of the most analysed and celebrated novels in English literature. People write doctoral dissertations about it. Artists create paintings and films and operas inspired by it. It has entered the cultural DNA of the English-speaking world, and Anne, the forgotten sister for so long, is finally being recognised as the radical feminist she was. The tenant of Wildfell Hall is taught in university courses on women's literature, on Victorian studies, on the history of feminism. Anne's voice, silenced for so long by Charlotte's well-meaning but misguided preface, is being heard again. The Fox sisters' legacy is more complicated but no less real. They sparked a movement that claimed millions of followers and still exists today. They revealed something profound about human psychology, about the power of belief, about what people need when they are grieving. They showed us that sometimes the lie people want to believe in tells us more truth about the human condition than any fact could. But beyond these specific legacies, beyond the books and the movement, I think these sisters left us something else. They left us examples of survival, of resilience, of finding ways to speak your truth even when the world does not want to hear it, of creating meaning and beauty and impact despite living under crushing constraints. Charlotte lost her mother, her two oldest sisters, her brother, and her two remaining sisters within a span of just over 20 years. She lived with grief that would have broken most people, and she kept writing, she kept creating. She transformed her pain into art that has touched millions of lives. Emily lived fiercely and on her own terms as much as any woman could in Victorian England. She refused to be tamed or softened or made acceptable. Her novel is as wild and untamed as she was. She wrote what she needed to write without compromise. Anne quietly revolutionized the novel form by telling truths about women's lives that no one else was willing to address. She did it without fanfare, without seeking credit, just because she believed those stories needed to be told. Kate and Maggie survived decades of performing, of living a lie, of being controlled and exhibited and used. They made a desperate confession that should have freed them, but instead left them more trapped than ever. And yet, they endured. They lived their lives as best they could within impossible circumstances. These are not stories of triumph in the conventional sense. These women did not win. They died young, or died poor, or died broken. But they mattered. They created things that outlasted them. They told truths that needed telling, and they showed us what it looks like to live with courage in the face of injustice. Now, I want to bring this back to you, because these stories are not just historical curiosities, they are mirrors. When I tell you about Charlotte hiding behind a male pseudonym, I'm asking you to think about the times you have hidden parts of yourself to be accepted. When I tell you about the Fox sisters trapped in a performance they could not escape, I'm asking you to consider the roles you play that feel inauthentic but necessary. We all live double lives to some extent. We all present different versions of ourselves in different contexts. The question is not whether we do this, but why, and at what cost, and whether we have any choice in the matter. For the Victorian sisters, the double life was imposed by a society that did not value women's voices, women's autonomy, women's full humanity. They had to hide or perform or lie because there was no other way to be heard, to survive, to matter. What about you? Are the double lives you're living necessary adaptations to unjust systems? Or are they habits you could challenge? Are you hiding because the world is not safe for your authentic self? Or are you hiding out of fear that has not been tested? These are not easy questions, and I am not suggesting there are simple answers. Sometimes hiding is survival, sometimes performance is protection, sometimes the double life is the only life available. But I think the Victorian sisters would also tell us this. Find the spaces where you can tell your truth. Maybe it is in your art, like the Brontes. Maybe it is in private letters to trusted friends. Maybe it is in anonymous online spaces where you can speak freely. Maybe it is in therapy or support groups or journals that no one else will read. Find the places where you do not have to perform, where you can be messy and complicated and fully human, and protect those spaces fiercely. And if you are in a position to create safety for others to be authentic, do it. Be the person who makes space for complexity, who does not demand performance, who accepts people as they are. Break the cycles that forced our Victorian sisters into their double lives. The world has changed enormously since the 1840s and 1850s. Women can vote, can own property, can pursue careers, can live independently. Legal protections exist that the Victorian sisters could not have imagined. But the fundamental struggle to be seen and valued as you truly are, that remains. There is something both sad and hopeful in that. Sad because it means the work is not done, that the battles our sisters fought are still being fought in new forms. But hopeful because it means their stories still matter, still speak to us, still offer wisdom and companionship across the distance of time. I think about Charlotte in the parsonage at Haworth, writing by candlelight after everyone else had gone to bed. I think about Emily walking the moors with her dogs, finding freedom in that wild landscape. I think about Anne quietly crafting her radical novels, knowing they would shock people but writing them anyway. I think about Kate and Maggie as children, creating those first rapping sounds, not knowing they were about to change history. These were real people, flawed, complicated, sometimes contradictory. They made mistakes, they hurt each other, they struggled and failed and got back up and struggled again. They were not saints or heroes in some distant, unreachable sense. They were human beings trying to live meaningful lives in difficult circumstances, and that is what makes their stories so powerful. Because if they could create beauty and meaning and lasting impact while living double lives under Victorian constraints, then perhaps we can too. Perhaps we can find ways to speak our truths, to create work that matters, to survive with grace and even joy despite the barriers we face. The night is ending, dawn is not far away, and you have spent these hours with me, listening to stories of sisters who lived more than a century ago. I want to thank you for that, for caring about these women, for following their journeys, for thinking about what their lives mean. These stories matter because all stories matter, because every human life contains lessons and beauty and truth, even lives that seemed small or tragic or forgotten. The Victorian sisters we have met tonight were dismissed by many in their own time, too poor, too provincial, too female, too young, too fraudulent. But they endured, their voices carried forward, and now we know their names, their struggles, their gifts. What stories are we dismissing in our own time? What voices are we not hearing because they do not fit our expectations or come from people we've been taught not to value? The Victorian sisters challenge us to look more carefully, to listen more closely, to recognize the extraordinary in places we've been told are ordinary. I hope you will carry these stories with you, not as distant history, but as living wisdom. When you face the pressure to perform rather than be authentic, remember Charlotte insisting on her truth, even while hiding behind a pseudonym. When you feel trapped in circumstances not of your making, remember Kate and Maggie finding moments of rebellion even within their exploitation. When you're told to be quiet or acceptable or less than you are, remember Emily refusing to be tamed, and remember this: the double life is often a survival strategy, not a moral failing. The performance is sometimes necessary, but seek out the spaces and people where you can drop the mask, where you can be yourself, messy and complete and true, and create those spaces for others when you can. The Victorian era is gone, but its legacy lingers in ways both obvious and subtle. The fight for women's equality continues. The pressure to perform acceptability continues. The struggle between authenticity and survival continues. And the stories of those who navigated these challenges before us offer guidance, companionship, and hope. So as this long night comes to an end, as you prepare to return to your own life, your own challenges, your own double lives or authentic spaces, I want to leave you with one final thought. You matter. Your truth matters. Your struggle to live authentically in a world that often demands performance, that matters. You're not alone in this. Across time and space, countless others have faced similar battles, and some of them, like our Victorian sisters, found ways to not just survive but to create, to speak, to leave marks that outlasted them. You can too. In your own way, in your own time, you can find your voice and use it. You can tell your truth, even if it has to be told slant, even if it requires strategies and workarounds. You can matter. You can endure. Thank you for spending this night with me. Thank you for listening to these stories of double lives and hidden truths, of sisters who struggled and survived and created legacies that echo still. I hope you found something here that resonated, something that offered comfort or insight or companionship. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of a long line of people trying to live with integrity in complicated times. And when you wake, may you find moments of authenticity, spaces of truth, and the courage to be yourself as fully as you can. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, stories of forgotten women and overlooked lives, of struggles and triumphs that history tried to erase, but that persist in whispers and fragments. Stories that need to be heard, that deserve to be remembered, that offer wisdom for our own journeys. So stay with me. Join me again soon as we explore another chapter of hidden history, another life lived in the shadows, another truth that demands to be spoken. There is so much more to discover together. Until then, rest well, dream deeply, and remember the Victorian sisters who lived double lives so that their truths could survive. They are with us still, in the pages of their books, in the legacy of their struggles, in the inspiration they offer to anyone trying to live authentically in a world that makes it difficult. Good night, and thank you.